Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Robert Hayes, and I've been a New York State Highway Patrol officer for 17 years now. In all that time, patrolling these endless stretches of interstate that cut through some of the most isolated country this side of the Mississippi, I've seen my share of strange things. Drunk drivers doing 80 in the wrong direction with their headlights off, thinking they're racing toward salvation instead of certain death. Families fleeing domestic violence in the dead of night. Children's faces pressed against rear windows like pale moons floating in the darkness. Semi-truck drivers who've been popping bennies for 3 days straight, hallucinating conversations with dead relatives through their CB radios. And more accident scenes than I care to remember. Twisted metal and broken glass scattered across the highway like some kind of modern art installation painted in blood and gasoline. But what happened to me on Route 17 near the Pennsylvania border in the fall of 1976 still keeps me awake some nights, even now, decades later. It keeps me staring at the ceiling fan in my bedroom, listening to it creak with each rotation, wondering if what I experienced was real, or if the isolation and darkness of those long highway shifts had finally driven me over the edge into madness. Sometimes I think madness would be easier to accept than the alternative. That what I encountered that night was something that shouldn't exist in any rational universe, something that operates by rules we don't understand and can't control. I was working the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., like I had been for the past 3 years. It wasn't a popular assignment. Most of the younger officers wanted day shifts or evenings, something with more action, more chance for advancement. But I'd grown to prefer the solitude of the midnight hours, the way the highway transformed after dark into something primal and honest. There's something about the darkness that strips away all the pretense and social conventions that make daytime interactions so complicated. At 3 in the morning, people show you who they really are. They don't have the energy to maintain their masks anymore, and you see them raw and unfiltered. It was a Tuesday night in late October 1976, the kind where the temperature drops just enough to make your breath visible but not quite cold enough for frost. The leaves were turning that deep amber color they get right before they fall, and during the day you could see them scattered across the highway like nature's confetti, celebrating the death of another year. There was something in the air that night, a heaviness, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, except no storm was coming. The weather service had predicted clear skies and light winds, perfect conditions for a quiet shift. But every cop who's worked the highway long enough learns to trust their instincts more than weather reports, and my instincts were telling me that this wouldn't be a quiet night. I'd started my patrol at 11:15 p.m. after spending 20 minutes in the parking lot of the Elmira State Police Barracks going through my equipment check. Flashlight with fresh batteries, backup flashlight in case the first one failed, first aid kit fully stocked, road flares, citation book, radio fully charged and tested on all frequencies. The same routine I'd followed for 3 years, but routine is what keeps you alive on the highway. Routine and vigilance and the kind of paranoid attention to detail that civilians mistake for obsessive-compulsive disorder, but that experienced cops recognize as the difference between going home safe and ending up in the morgue. My assigned sector was the western section of Route 17, a 40-mile stretch of mostly empty highway that runs through some of the most isolated country in the state. During the day, it's scenic enough, rolling hills covered in oak and maple forests that stretch to the horizon, the occasional farm with weathered barns and fields full of corn stubble, small towns with populations that haven't changed significantly since the 1950s. The kind of places where everyone knows everyone else's business, where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football game on Friday nights, where strangers are noticed immediately and remembered for years. But at night, especially on a shift like mine, it becomes something else entirely. The darkness seems to press in from all sides, thick and almost tangible, like you're driving through black water instead of air. Your headlights only push it back so far before it swallows everything whole, and beyond that cone of illumination, anything could be waiting. Deer, certainly. We get a lot of them crossing the highway at night, especially during rutting season, and more than one driver has met their end when a full-grown buck decides to play chicken with a Buick traveling at 70 miles per hour. But there are other things too, things that don't show up in official reports, but that every officer who's worked this stretch long enough has encountered at least once. The first few hours of my shift were routine, or as routine as anything gets on the graveyard shift. I made 2 traffic stops, a speeder doing 90 in a 65 zone, some kid from Rochester heading home from a party, and clearly still drunk enough that he should have been sleeping it off in someone's guest room instead of piloting 2 tons of Detroit steel down a dark highway. I gave him a sobriety test, which he failed spectacularly, and arrested him for DUI. The booking process took 45 minutes, and by the time I got back on the road, it was nearly 1 a.m. The second stop was an 18-wheeler with a burned-out taillight, whose driver thanked me profusely for the warning instead of a citation. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, who'd been driving truck for 4 decades and had stories about every mile of highway between here and California. We talked for 10 minutes about road conditions and weather patterns and the best truck stops between here and Buffalo, the kind of conversation that reminds you why most truckers are some of the most decent people you'll ever meet on the highway. I also responded to one minor fender bender near the Painted Post exit, where a woman from Pennsylvania had rear-ended a local farmer at a stop sign. No injuries, minimal damage, just 2 people who'd both had long days and weren't paying as much attention as they should have been. The paperwork took 30 minutes, and everyone was on their way by 12:45 a.m. with nothing more serious than slightly higher insurance premiums and a lesson about following distances. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I first noticed the runner. I was heading eastbound, maybe 15 miles outside of Elmira, cruising at 65 and scanning the shoulders for deer sign. The radio had been quiet for the past hour, except for the occasional check-in from other units working different sectors. Unit 23 was dealing with a domestic disturbance call near Corning. Apparently some guy had decided that 1 a.m. was the perfect time to settle a grudge with his ex-wife by throwing rocks through her living room window. Unit 41 had pulled over for a coffee break at the all-night diner in Hornell, one of the few places in this part of the state where you could get a decent cup of coffee and a piece of pie at this hour. That's when my headlights caught movement on the shoulder ahead. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We get a lot of them crossing the highway at night, especially during rutting season when the bucks get stupid and aggressive. They have a tendency to freeze in headlights like they're posing for a photograph, standing perfectly still while 2 tons of automobile bears down on them at highway speed. But as I got closer, slowing down and preparing to hit my horn to scare it back into the woods, I could see it was a person, a woman, running along the shoulder in the same direction I was traveling. She was wearing what looked like a white dress or nightgown, something that flowed behind her as she moved, and she was barefoot. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, I could see she was moving with purpose, not jogging for exercise or health, but running like she was trying to get somewhere fast, like she was running from something or toward something with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from mortal fear. I slowed down further and hit my spotlight, sweeping it across the shoulder to get a better look. The beam caught her clearly for just a moment, and what I saw made me ease off the accelerator even more. She was a young woman, maybe 25 or 30, with long dark hair that streamed behind her as she ran. Her dress was torn in several places, hanging in tatters that suggested violent contact with brambles or barbed wire or something worse. Even from my patrol car, I could see what looked like blood on the fabric. Dark stains that could have been anything but that my 17 years of experience told me were probably exactly what they appeared to be. I pulled over about 50 yards ahead of her and got out, leaving my emergency lights on and my engine running. Standard protocol for a potential emergency situation: maintain visibility, preserve the ability to pursue or retreat as circumstances required, keep your radio within reach in case you needed backup. I kept my flashlight on my belt but put my hand near it, following the training that had been drilled into me at the academy. In 17 years of highway patrol, I'd learned that you never knew what kind of situation you were walking into, especially at this hour when rational people were home in bed and the highway belonged to insomniacs, addicts, fugitives, and the emotionally damaged. "Ma'am," I called out as she approached, using my best authoritative but non-threatening voice. "State Police, are you all right?" She didn't slow down. If anything, she seemed to pick up speed, veering slightly away from my patrol car but continuing to run eastbound along the shoulder. As she passed under my spotlight, I got my first clear look at her face, and what I saw made something cold and unpleasant crawl up my spine. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else there too, something that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't immediately identify. She looked right through me, as if I wasn't even there, as if my patrol car and my uniform and my voice calling out to her were just background noise that didn't register in whatever reality she was currently inhabiting. Her mouth was open, and I could see her lips moving rapidly, but no sound was coming out. Or, if there was sound, it was too quiet for me to hear over the idle of my engine and the whisper of wind through the trees. But it was her eyes that bothered me the most. They weren't just terrified, they were empty. Not vacant like someone who was drunk or drugged, but empty like windows looking into an abandoned house. "Ma'am, stop!" I called again, louder this time, putting more authority into my voice. "I need to speak with you." But she was already past me and disappearing back into the darkness beyond my headlights. I got back in my car and followed slowly, keeping pace with her at maybe 15 miles per hour. She maintained that same steady pace. Not a sprint that would burn her out in a few hundred yards, but not a casual jog either. It was faster than any normal person should be able to sustain for very long, especially barefoot on rough asphalt that would shred unprotected feet within minutes. But she showed no signs of slowing down, no indication that she was feeling any discomfort at all. I radioed dispatch, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the growing unease in my gut. "Unit 47 to dispatch." "Go ahead, 47. The voice belonged to Dorothy Kellerman, a 30-year veteran dispatcher who'd heard everything at least twice and never seemed rattled by anything. "I've got a possible 1054 on Route 17, mile marker 238. Female, approximately 25 to 30 years old, appears to be in distress. She's running eastbound on the shoulder, won't respond to verbal commands." "Copy, 47. Do you need backup?" I watched the woman in my headlights, still running with that same mechanical precision. Something about the way she moved bothered me on a level I couldn't articulate. Too smooth, too consistent, like she was floating just above the asphalt instead of actually making contact with it. "Negative for now," I replied. "But can you check for any reported missing persons or domestic disturbances in the area? Female matches the description I gave you, appears to have been injured." "Will do, 47. Maintain visual contact and keep us posted." I followed her for almost 3 miles like that, creeping along at 15 miles per hour with my hazard lights on in case any other traffic came up behind me. Not that there was much chance of that. Route 17 through this section sees maybe a dozen cars between midnight and dawn on a good night, and most of those are long-haul truckers who know to use the passing lane when they encounter a state police vehicle moving slowly. The woman never slowed down, never looked back, never acknowledged my presence at all. She just kept running with that same eerie consistency, her bare feet making no sound that I could hear even when I rolled down my windows, her torn dress flowing behind her like she was underwater instead of running through the cool October air. Every few seconds I'd try calling out to her through my PA system, but she never responded. It was like trying to communicate with a sleepwalker. Around mile marker 240, I noticed something else that bothered me. Despite running for nearly 3 miles at a pace that should have had her gasping for breath, she showed no signs of fatigue. Her form remained perfect, her rhythm unchanged. Most people running that distance that fast would be stumbling by now, their body language showing the strain of sustained effort. But she moved like a machine, like something programmed to maintain exactly that speed, regardless of physical limitations. It was around mile marker 241 that things started to get really strange. I was still following her, wondering how much longer she could keep up this pace and starting to worry about what would happen when she finally collapsed from exhaustion, when my radio crackled to life with a burst of static. Then, clear as day, I heard a voice, a woman's voice, desperate and pleading. "Please, someone help me. He's coming back." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static. I grabbed my radio, my heart rate spiking. "Dispatch, did you copy that transmission?" "-47. Copy what transmission?" "Female voice requesting assistance." Sounded like she was in immediate danger. "We haven't received any transmissions on this frequency except yours, 47. Are you sure it wasn't coming from another unit?" I was sure. I'd been working these radios for 17 years, and I knew the difference between a legitimate transmission and interference from CB radios or atmospheric conditions. This had been a clear, desperate human voice using police frequency protocols. But before I could respond, the voice came through again, clearer this time and somehow more urgent. "He killed me. He killed me and left me in the woods. Someone please find me." The voice was coming through my radio, but it wasn't following our standard procedures. There was no unit identification, no proper call signs, no indication of location or nature of emergency. Just that desperate, pleading voice, growing more frantic with each transmission. And there was something else, something about the voice itself that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. "Officer Hayes. Officer Hayes, can you hear me?" That made my blood run cold. The voice knew my name, but more than that, it knew my rank and assignment. Only someone with access to personnel files or radio communications logs would know that Unit 47 was assigned to Officer Robert Hayes. I looked up from my radio and realized the woman had stopped running. She was standing in my headlights about 30 yards ahead, facing away from me. Her long, dark hair hung down her back like a curtain, and that torn white dress billowed slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel from inside my patrol car. She stood perfectly still, unnaturally still, like a statue. Slowly, very slowly, she turned around. Even from 30 yards away, I could see that her face was wrong. Pale as moonlight, with dark hollows where her eyes should be. Her mouth was open in a perfect O, as if she was screaming, but no sound was coming out. "Officer Hayes?" The voice crackled through my radio again, and this time I was sure it was coming from the woman standing in my headlights. "You have to find my body." The woman on the road began walking toward my car, not running now, just walking with slow, deliberate steps. Each time she moved forward, my headlights seemed to dim slightly, as if something was draining the power from my electrical system. The engine was still running fine, but the dashboard lights had started to flicker, and I could hear a high-pitched whining sound coming from somewhere under the hood. I put the car in reverse and backed up, trying to maintain distance between us. She kept walking forward with that same steady pace, and I noticed something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel.
She wasn't casting a shadow. With my headlights shining directly on her, she should have been casting a long, dark shadow on the asphalt behind her, but there was nothing. The radio crackled again. Route 17, mile marker 244, in the woods. He buried me there. Mile marker 244 was about 3 miles ahead, right around the bend where the highway curves north toward Corning. I'd driven past that spot thousands of times over the years. There were woods on both sides of the road there, thick enough that you couldn't see more than 20 feet into them, even during the day. Dense oak and maple forest that stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by the occasional logging road or abandoned hunting cabin. The woman was getting closer to my car now, close enough that I could see the details of her face in my headlights. What I saw made me gun the engine in reverse, tires squealing on the asphalt as I tried to put distance between us. Her face was empty, not just pale, but hollow, like looking at a mask with nothing behind it. Where her eyes should have been were just dark holes that seemed to go on forever. Her mouth was moving in that silent scream, and I could see that her teeth were broken, jagged stumps stained with something dark. "Find me!" the radio pleaded, and the voice was definitely coming from that impossible woman walking toward my car. "Before he comes back for the others." I spun the car around and floored it, racing eastbound toward mile marker 244. In my rearview mirror, I could see the woman standing in the middle of the road, growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared entirely into the darkness. But I could still hear her voice through the radio, fainter now but still audible over the static. The radio went silent. I reached mile marker 244 in about 2 minutes, driving faster than I should have on that winding stretch of highway. I pulled over at the marker and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves and figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel, and I could taste copper in my mouth. The metallic flavor of pure adrenaline. Protocol said I should call for backup, but how do you explain what I'd just experienced? How do you tell dispatch that you followed what might have been a ghost for 3 miles, and she told you through your radio where to find her body? I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car. The woods on the north side of the highway were thick with oak and maple trees, their branches forming a canopy so dense that even my high-powered flashlight beam barely penetrated 10 feet. But something was drawing me in that direction, a feeling I can't really describe, like an invisible hand pulling me forward. I pushed through the underbrush, following what might have been an old deer trail. The leaves crunched under my boots, unnaturally loud in the silence of the forest. Every few steps I'd stop and listen, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. No night sounds, no owl calls or cricket chirps or rustling of small animals in the brush. Just silence so complete it seemed to have weight. About 50 yards in, my flashlight beam caught something that didn't belong. A patch of disturbed earth, maybe 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The soil was darker than the surrounding ground, and it had settled in a way that suggested something was buried underneath. The leaves and forest debris that covered the rest of the ground had been cleared away from this area, leaving bare dirt that looked recently turned. Near one end of the patch, a piece of white fabric protruded from the dirt. The same white fabric I'd seen on the running woman's dress. I should have called it in right then. Should have backed out of those woods and waited for backup and the crime scene unit. But something compelled me to dig. Some voice in my head that might have been my own intuition or might have been something else entirely, whispering that this couldn't wait, that evidence might be destroyed if I left to get help. I used my hands at first, then the small emergency shovel I kept in my patrol car. The soil was soft, recently disturbed, and it didn't take long before my shovel hit something solid. Wood, from the sound of it. I cleared away more dirt and found the edge of what looked like a wooden box, roughly the size of a coffin but crudely made. The lid wasn't nailed down, just held in place by the weight of the dirt. I brushed away the remaining soil and lifted it.
Inside was the body of a young woman. She'd been dead for days, maybe a week. The smell hit me immediately. That sweet, cloying odor of decomposition that once experienced is never forgotten. Her long dark hair was matted with blood and dirt, and she was wearing the remains of a white nightgown that had once been clean, but was now stained with mud and worse things. Her face was exactly what I'd seen in my headlights. Pale, hollow, with empty sockets where her eyes used to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her mouth was sewn shut with thick black thread, the stitches crude and uneven. Someone had taken great care to make sure she couldn't scream, couldn't call for help, couldn't say whatever final words she might have wanted to say before she died. I stumbled backward, away from the makeshift grave, and radioed for backup. Within an hour, the woods were crawling with state police, county sheriffs, and FBI agents. Crime scene technicians took photographs from every angle, collected soil samples, measured and documented everything with scientific precision. The body was carefully removed and transported to the county morgue for autopsy. The victim was identified as Helen Morrison, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher from Elmira, who had been reported missing 6 days earlier by her sister when she failed to show up for work. Helen lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, taught second grade at Lincoln Elementary, and had no known enemies or dangerous associations. By all accounts, she was a quiet, well-liked woman who kept to herself and posed no threat to anyone. The investigation revealed that Helen had been abducted from her apartment sometime during the evening of October 20th. Her car was found in her assigned parking space. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry, and there were no witnesses to her disappearance. Security cameras in the area had malfunctioned that night, not unusual for the older apartment complex where Helen lived, but frustrating for investigators. The medical examiner's report made for grim reading. Helen had been held captive for approximately 72 hours before her death. During that time, she had been subjected to what the report carefully described as extensive trauma. Her eyes had been removed while she was still alive, probably with a sharp instrument like a scalpel. The stitches in her mouth had been put in place before death as well, using what appeared to be heavy fishing line. But here's the thing that still haunts me. According to the coroner's report, Helen Morrison had been dead for at least 72 hours when I found her body. The time of death was estimated to be somewhere between October 22nd and 23rd. I encountered the woman in white on the night of October 26th. Helen Morrison couldn't have been the woman I followed along Route 17. So who was running along that highway at 1:30 in the morning? Who was speaking to me through my radio, begging me to find her body? And why did she look exactly like the corpse I found buried in the woods? The official investigation never found Helen's killer. Detectives interviewed everyone who had known her, followed up on every lead, checked alibis and phone records and financial transactions. They found nothing. No evidence of stalking, no threatening letters or phone calls, no suspicious characters hanging around her apartment or workplace. Helen Morrison had simply vanished from her normal life and reappeared 3 miles away, dead and buried in a makeshift grave in the woods. The case went cold after 6 months, filed away with thousands of other unsolved murders. But I kept working that stretch of highway, and I kept watching for any sign of the woman in white. I never saw her again, but I heard her. 3 months later, on a cold January night when snow was falling heavy enough to make driving treacherous, I was patrolling the same section of Route 17 when my radio crackled to life with that same desperate voice. "Officer Hayes, there's another one. Mile marker 251. I found Sarah Williams buried in the woods near mile marker 251. 26 years old, a nurse from Corning who worked the night shift at the regional hospital. Same M.O. as Helen Morrison. Eyes removed, mouth sewn shut, buried in a crude wooden box. The medical examiner estimated she'd been dead for 4 days before I found her. 6 months after that, the voice came through my radio again. "Mile marker 239.
Her name is Dorothy. He's getting bolder. Dorothy Chen, a 32-year-old pharmacist from Hornell. Eyes removed, mouth sewn shut, buried for 5 days before I found her. The investigation turned up the same nothing as the previous cases. No witnesses, no evidence, no obvious motive or connection between the victims except their gender and approximate age. Each time, the voice came through my radio first, guiding me to the burial site. Each time, the woman had been dead for days before I found her. And each time, the investigation turned up nothing but questions that had no answers and evidence that led nowhere. After the fourth body, Betty Walsh, a 29-year-old librarian found near mile marker 246, I started to piece together a pattern. All the women were between 25 and 35 years old. All had long, dark hair. All lived alone in small apartments or houses. All had jobs that brought them into contact with the public but didn't require them to work with dangerous people. And all had been abducted on Tuesday nights. I started spending my Tuesday night shifts parked at different points along Route 17, watching, waiting. I installed a tape recorder in my patrol car to document any radio transmissions that dispatch claimed they couldn't hear. I mapped every burial site, looking for connections or patterns that might help identify the killer. I read everything I could find about serial killers and their methods, trying to understand the mind behind these methodical murders. What I found terrified me more than any ghost ever could. The burial sites formed a perfect line along Route 17, spaced exactly 3 miles apart. Mile marker 238, 241, 244, 247, 251, 254. Whoever was doing this was working methodically, systematically, marking his territory like some kind of predator claiming hunting grounds. And with each new victim, he was getting closer to populated areas, closer to the small towns and cities where more potential victims lived their unsuspecting lives. On a Tuesday night in July 1977, I was parked near mile marker 230 when I saw headlights approaching from the west. It was around 2 a.m., well past the time when normal traffic would be on the road. The vehicle was moving slowly, maybe 40 miles per hour, and I could see it had something strapped down in the bed. As it passed under a streetlight near the exit ramp, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a scruffy beard, wearing what looked like work clothes. In the truck bed, wrapped in a blue tarp and secured with bungee cords, was something roughly the size and shape of a human body. I waited until the truck was well past me, then pulled out and followed at a distance with my lights off. The truck turned onto a dirt access road that led into the state forest, an area I knew was used primarily by hunters and loggers during the appropriate seasons. But it was July, well outside hunting season, and no logging operations were scheduled for that part of the forest. I followed the truck about a mile off the highway before it stopped in a small clearing. The driver got out and began unloading his cargo, working quickly and efficiently like someone who had done this before. I called for backup, then moved in on foot, staying in the tree line and trying to get close enough to see what was happening. What I saw in that clearing will haunt me for the rest of my life. The man had the woman, still alive but barely conscious, laid out on a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. She was bound with rope at her wrists and ankles, and there was duct tape over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, darting back and forth as she tried to understand what was happening to her. The man was humming to himself as he worked, arranging tools on a smaller table beside his makeshift operating surface. The tools looked like something from a medical facility: scalpels, forceps, syringes, bottles of what might have been anesthetic. But there were other things too, things that had no business in any legitimate medical procedure. A sewing kit with thick black thread, a small wooden box that looked suspiciously like a miniature coffin, and a collection of glass jars filled with clear liquid, each one containing what looked like a pair of human eyes. I should have waited for backup.
I should have followed protocol and remained in position until other units arrived. But when I saw him pick up a scalpel and move toward the woman's face, I couldn't wait any longer. "State police, freeze." He spun around, scalpel still in his hand, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. William Patterson, 53 years old, a maintenance worker for the county highway department. I'd seen him a dozen times over the years, working on road repairs along my patrol route. He'd always seemed like a harmless, quiet guy, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without giving a second thought. But the face I saw in that clearing was nothing like the mild-mannered county employee I remembered. His eyes were completely black in my flashlight beam, like looking into deep water at night. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had been filed to points, giving him the appearance of some kind of predatory animal. "Officer Hayes," he said, and his voice was exactly the same voice I'd been hearing through my radio for months. Not similar, exactly the same down to the intonation and accent. "You're just in time for the show." He lunged at me with the scalpel, moving faster than any man his age should have been able to move. I drew my service weapon and put 3 rounds center mass, and he went down hard. But as he fell, he was laughing, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat, like it was echoing up from a well. "You can't stop what's already started," he wheezed, blood frothing from his mouth and nose. "I planted the seeds. They're growing. They'll all come back to run the highway. All of them." He died before backup arrived. We saved the woman, Margaret Foster, a 31-year-old librarian from Hornell who'd been missing for 2 days. She recovered from her physical injuries, though she bore scars that would never fully heal. But she never spoke again about what happened during those 2 days she was held captive. The doctor said it was trauma-induced amnesia, a psychological defense mechanism. When we searched Patterson's property, a rundown farmhouse about 10 miles outside Elmira, we found evidence linking him to all 7 murders along Route 17. In his basement, we discovered what could only be described as a laboratory, complete with medical equipment, preservation chemicals, and detailed anatomical charts. The walls were covered with photographs of his victims, taken both before and after death, arranged in a careful chronological order that suggested long-term planning and meticulous record-keeping. We also found journals filled with drawings and writings that made no sense to anyone who read them. Pages and pages of symbols that looked almost like a foreign language, mixed with detailed maps of Route 17 and obsessive notes about the running women and calling them home. Some of the entries described rituals involving the removal of eyes and the silencing of voices, as if Patterson believed he was performing some kind of religious ceremony rather than committing murder. One entry, dated 3 days before Helen Morrison's disappearance, read, "She will run the highway forever now. She will guide them to me, and I will give them the same gift. Eyes to see beyond death, voices to speak from the other side. They will all run together, a procession of the enlightened, leading others to their transformation." The case was closed. The killer was dead. Justice, in a way, had been served, but it didn't end there. 2 weeks after Patterson's death, I was working my usual Tuesday night shift when my radio crackled to life with that familiar voice. "Officer Hayes, mile marker 233. I found another body buried near mile marker 233. A woman named Ruth Coleman, 27 years old, missing for 6 days from her apartment in Bath. Same MO as all the others. Eyes removed, mouth sewn shut, buried in a wooden box. The medical examiner confirmed that Ruth had been killed using the same methods and tools that Patterson had used on his previous victims. Patterson had been dead for 2 weeks when Ruth Coleman was murdered. The investigation stalled immediately. There were no other suspects, no evidence pointing to an accomplice or copycat killer. Patterson's journals had been analyzed by criminal psychologists and linguists, but no one could make sense of the symbols and references he'd used. As far as anyone could tell, Patterson had been working alone. But the murders continued. Every 3 months, like clockwork, my radio would crackle with that desperate female voice, guiding me to another burial site along Route 17. Always the same pattern. Young women with long dark hair, abducted on Tuesday nights, found days later with their eyes removed and mouths sewn shut. The spacing between burial sites remained consistent, exactly 3 miles apart, forming a line that stretched eastward along the highway. I started keeping a private log of the incidents, separate from my official reports. The department brass didn't want to hear about mysterious radio transmissions or ghost women running along the highway. They wanted facts, evidence, things they could put in reports and present to district attorneys. Supernatural explanations didn't fit their worldview or their case closure statistics. But I knew what I was experiencing was real, even if I couldn't explain it or prove it to anyone else's satisfaction. The voices began to change after Patterson's death. Instead of just Helen Morrison's voice guiding me to burial sites, I started hearing from the other victims as well. Sarah Williams would whisper directions to her killer's latest victim. Dorothy Chen would provide warnings about upcoming abductions. Betty Walsh would describe the killer's appearance and methods in detail that proved accurate when checked against evidence. But they never told me who the killer was now. They never provided information that would help catch him before he struck again. They only guided me to the bodies after the fact, ensuring that the victims were found and properly buried, that their families had answers about what had happened to their missing daughters and sisters. Over the next 3 years, I found 14 more bodies. 14 more women who died the same horrible death that Helen Morrison had died, killed by someone who should have been impossible to catch, because he was following the methods of a dead man. The pattern became more complex as time went on. The radio transmissions weren't just coming during my shifts anymore. Other officers started reporting similar experiences. Officer William Baker found Linda Thompson near mile marker 257 after hearing her voice through his radio. Sergeant Richard Stone discovered Carol Martinez near mile marker 260 following similar guidance. Each officer described the same phenomenon, a desperate female voice pleading for help, leading them to burial sites where bodies had been waiting for days. But none of the other officers ever saw the woman in white running along the highway. That particular manifestation seemed reserved for me alone, as if Helen Morrison had formed some kind of personal connection during our encounter that October night in 1976. I started investigating the history of Route 17 itself, looking for clues about why this particular stretch of highway had become such a focal point for supernatural activity. What I found was more disturbing than I'd expected. Route 17 had been built in the 1920s, following roughly the same path as an old Indian trail that connected tribal territories across what would become New York State. But before that, the area had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances dating back to the colonial period. Local historical records mentioned women who vanished while traveling the trail. Their bodies sometimes found weeks later in the surrounding forests with their eyes missing and their mouths sewn shut with sinew. The pattern had continued through the centuries, with clusters of similar murders occurring every 20 to 30 years. Always women, always the same mutilations, always buried along what was now Route 17. The authorities of each era had blamed different perpetrators: Indian raids, wild animals, bandits, serial killers. But the consistency of the method suggested something else entirely. Something that had been using this particular corridor for hunting for centuries. Something that had adapted to changing times but never changed its essential nature. The more I researched, the more I realized that Patterson hadn't been the first. He was just the latest in a long line of people who had been chosen, or possessed, or driven to continue an ancient pattern of murder and mutilation that stretched back centuries.
In 1980, I requested a transfer to a different patrol area. I couldn't take it anymore. The sleepless nights, the constant dread every time my radio crackled with static, the knowledge that somewhere out there, a killer was continuing his work with supernatural assistance from his victims. My commanding officer granted the transfer without questions, probably grateful to get rid of an officer who'd been filing increasingly bizarre incident reports about ghost sightings and mysterious radio transmissions. I spent the last 15 years of my career working the Albany area, far from Route 17 and its ghostly highway runner. But I kept in touch with colleagues who worked my old beat, and they told me the murders continued. Different officers would find the bodies now, guided by radio transmissions that dispatch insisted never happened. The pattern never changed. Every 3 months, another young woman would disappear on a Tuesday night, only to be found days later in the woods along Route 17. Some of the officers who worked that route started requesting transfers after 6 months or a year. They'd start hearing the voices, too, seeing things in their headlights that shouldn't be there, finding bodies in places they had no logical reason to search. The department developed an unofficial policy of rotating officers through that sector every 18 months, claiming it was to prevent burnout and maintain fresh perspectives on the ongoing investigation. But I knew the real reason. The highway was changing people. Route 17 had become something more than just a stretch of asphalt connecting small towns. It had become a hunting ground, a burial ground, and somehow, impossibly, a communication network between the living and the dead. The murders continued through the 1980s and 1990s with clockwork regularity. Every 3 months, another body. Every burial site exactly 3 miles from the last. Every victim, a young woman with long dark hair, abducted on a Tuesday night and found days later with her eyes removed and mouth sewn shut. The investigation remained officially open, but no meaningful progress was ever made. DNA evidence was collected from later crime scenes, but it never matched anything in the databases. Security cameras were installed at key points along Route 17, but they consistently malfunctioned on Tuesday nights when abductions occurred. Task forces were formed and disbanded. Federal agents were brought in and eventually reassigned to other cases. But the bodies kept appearing, and the voices kept guiding officers to find them. In 1995, I retired from the state police and moved to Florida. I thought I'd finally put it all behind me, that the distance and the warm weather and the palm trees would help me forget about cold October nights and women in white running along dark highways. I bought a small house in Clearwater, took up fishing, tried to live like a normal retiree who'd put in his 30 years and earned the right to a peaceful old age. I was wrong. Last month, I got a call from Detective James Morrison, Helen Morrison's younger brother, who'd become a cop partly because of what happened to his sister. He'd been following the Route 17 murders for years, trying to find some connection the original investigators had missed, some pattern or clue that would finally lead to an arrest. "I need to ask you something," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the same bone-deep weariness I remembered from my own years working that case. "And I need you to be completely honest with me." I told him I would be. "In all those years you worked Route 17, did you ever see her? Did you ever see Helen running along the highway?" I was quiet for a long time before I answered, staring out at the Florida sunset and remembering October nights in New York when the darkness pressed in from all sides. "Yes, but only once. The night I found her body." "I've been working this case for 20 years, he said. "I've talked to every officer who's found one of these bodies, current and retired. Every single one of them reports the same thing. They see a woman in white running along the highway before their radio guides them to a burial site." "How many bodies have there been?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 137, he said. and the number hit me like a physical blow. 137 women, all killed the same way, all buried along Route 17. The last one was found 3 days ago. 137 women. All because I pulled over to help what I thought was someone in distress on a lonely highway in 1976. All because I followed a ghost into the woods and found the first body, somehow setting in motion a chain of events that had been continuing for decades. There's something else, Detective Morrison continued. Something we've never released to the press. When we searched Patterson's property back in 1977, we didn't find all of his journals. Last week, we got a tip about a storage unit he'd been renting under a false name since 1975. He paused, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, like he was struggling with what to say next. We found the rest of his journals. And Robert, some of those entries are dated after his death. Someone's been continuing his work, writing in his journals, following his rituals. But the handwriting analysis confirms it's all Patterson's writing, even the entries from last week. That's impossible, I said. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. Nothing about this case had ever been possible, and impossibility was no longer a meaningful concept when it came to Route 17. The recent entries describe the murders in detail. Murders that happened decades after Patterson died. They include information that was never released to the public, details that only the killer could have known. Whoever's doing this has access to Patterson's original journals, knows his methods perfectly, and is somehow able to replicate his handwriting exactly. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my Florida retirement home, staring out at the palm trees and trying to make sense of what Detective Morrison had told me. But some things can't be made sense of. Some things exist beyond our understanding of how the world works, in spaces where logic and reason have no power. What I know is this. On October 26, 1976, I pulled over to help a woman I thought was in distress. That woman led me to the body of Helen Morrison, and in doing so, she saved the life of Margaret Foster and potentially dozens of other women who might have become Patterson's victims if he hadn't been caught. But she also opened a door that should have stayed closed. Every 3 months for the past 47 years, that door has opened again. A woman in white runs along Route 17, guiding officers to burial sites, ensuring that the victims are found and their families have closure. And somewhere out there, a killer continues his work, following patterns established by a dead man, adding to a collection that grows by 4 bodies every year. Detective Morrison retired last month without solving the case. The new detective assigned to the Route 17 murders is a young woman named Patricia Wells, fresh out of the State Police Academy and eager to make her mark on a case that stumped investigators for decades. She called me yesterday. "Mr. Hayes," she said, and I could hear the confidence in her voice, the certainty that comes from youth and inexperience. "I've read all your reports from 1976 to 1980. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I told her I would be. "Do you think she's trying to help us? The woman in white, do you think she's trying to help us catch the killer?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered, remembering 47 years of radio transmissions and burial sites, and families who got to bury their daughters because a ghost showed a cop where to dig. "I think she's trying to make sure the victims are found. Whether that's the same thing as helping us, I don't know." "There's something else," Detective Wells said. "Something that wasn't in your reports." "What's that?" "In your incident report from the night you found Helen Morrison's body, you wrote that the woman you followed was running eastbound along Route 17, but according to the burial site location and the direction you came from, she should have been running westbound if she was leading you to the body." She was right. I'd never thought about it before, but she was right. If Helen Morrison's body was buried north of mile marker 244, and I was traveling eastbound when I first spotted the runner, then the woman should have been running westbound to lead me to the burial site. But she'd been running east, the same direction I was traveling. So, where was she really leading you?
Detective Wells asked. I didn't have an answer for her then, and I don't have one now. But 3 nights ago, I had a dream that felt more real than any dream should. I was back on Route 17, driving my old patrol car through the darkness. In my headlights, I could see a woman in white running along the shoulder. But this time, I could see her face clearly, and it wasn't Helen Morrison. It was Detective Patricia Wells. And behind her, running single file like some horrible procession, were all the others. 137 women in torn white dresses, running eastbound along Route 17, their faces hollow and empty, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. At the front of the line, leading them all, was Helen Morrison. But she wasn't running. She was walking backward, facing the others, her arms outstretched as if she was conducting an orchestra. And on her face was an expression I'd never seen before. Not terror, not pain, but something that might have been satisfaction. In my dream, my radio crackled to life with her voice. "Officer Hayes, we're bringing them all home now. Every last one." I woke up in a cold sweat, and the first thing I did was call Detective Wells. But her phone went straight to voicemail. I called the New York State Police headquarters, and they told me she'd requested emergency leave for a family matter and wouldn't be back for at least a week. But I know better. I know she's driving Route 17 right now, following a woman in white who's been running eastbound for 47 years, leading her toward whatever waits at the end of that long, dark highway. And I know that somewhere in those woods, something is preparing its tools, humming to itself as it works, following rituals written in journals by a dead man whose work will never be finished. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some runners never reach their destination, and some highways lead places you were never meant to go. 2 days ago, I started getting reports from other retired officers who'd worked Route 17 over the years. Officer William Baker, who found Linda Thompson in 1978, called to tell me he'd been having dreams about women in white running along an endless highway. Sergeant Richard Stone, who discovered Carol Martinez in 1981, said he'd been waking up at 3 a.m. every night with the sound of radio static in his ears. Yesterday, I got a call from Margaret Foster, the woman we'd saved from Patterson's makeshift laboratory in 1977. She's 78 now, a retired librarian living quietly in a nursing home not far from my own home. But something in her voice told me her quiet retirement was about to end. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone before. About those 2 days I was held captive." "Margaret, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Because I remember everything. I've always remembered everything. The doctors said it was amnesia, but I lied. I couldn't tell them what I really saw, what Patterson really showed me." She took a deep breath, and when she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He didn't just kill those women, Mr. Hayes. He was preparing them for something. He would remove their eyes so they could see beyond the veil, as he called it. He would sew their mouths shut to preserve their voices for the journey home. He wasn't just a serial killer. He was a recruiter. A recruiter for what? For whatever runs Route 17 at night. Whatever's been hunting women along that highway for centuries. Patterson was just the latest in a long line of servants, and when he died, something else took his place. Something that doesn't need a physical body to continue the work. The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear Margaret breathing heavily on the other end. "There's something else," she said. "Detective Wells came to see me 3 days ago. She wanted to know about my experiences with Patterson, about what I remembered from those 2 days. I told her the truth, all of it. And when I was finished, she just smiled and said, 'Thank you. Now I understand what I have to do.'" What did she mean by that? I think she's going to try to end it. She's going to follow the highway to wherever it really leads and try to stop whatever's been killing women for all these years.
Margaret, that's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to finally close the door you opened back in 1976. That night, I had another dream. I was driving Route 17 again, but this time I wasn't alone in my patrol car. In the passenger seat was a young woman with long, dark hair and empty eye sockets, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. She turned to look at me, and somehow, impossibly, she smiled. "Thank you," she said, though her sewn lips never moved. "For finding us, for making sure we weren't forgotten. But now it's time to come home." I woke up with the taste of highway asphalt in my mouth and the sound of radio static in my ears. When I looked out my window, I could see headlights in the distance, coming closer. A single car, driving slowly through the retirement community, heading east towards something that doesn't exist on any map. The car stopped in front of my house and the driver got out. It was Detective Patricia Wells, but she looked different somehow. Thinner, paler, with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. She walked up to my front door and knocked. "Mr. Hayes," she said when I answered. "It's time to go." "Go where?" "Home. Route 17, where it all began and where it has to end." I looked at her more closely and realized what was different about her appearance. Her eyes were completely black, like looking into deep water at night. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth had been filed to sharp points. "The highway calls," she said, and her voice was exactly the same voice I'd been hearing through my radio for 47 years. "And we all have to answer eventually." Behind her, I could see other cars pulling up to my house, dozens of them, all with New York plates, all driven by people I recognized, other officers who'd worked Route 17 over the years, their faces pale and their eyes black, their teeth filed to sharp points. In the distance, I could hear the sound of running footsteps on asphalt getting closer. The woman in white had finally reached the end of her journey, and now she was coming to collect the rest of us. As I write this, I can hear them outside my house, knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, calling the names of everyone who'd ever had contact with Route 17. The retired officers, the dispatchers, the crime scene technicians, the coroner who'd performed the autopsies, even the families of the victims, the siblings and parents who'd identified bodies and attended funerals. 137 women have died along Route 17 over the past 47 years. But it turns out they weren't really dying. They were being recruited, prepared, transformed into something that could exist in the space between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. And now the recruitment drive is expanding. The highway always gets its due in the end. Route 17 runs for 397 miles through New York State, according to the official maps. But I know better now. I know it runs much farther than that. It runs through places that don't appear on any map, connecting the world of the living with something else entirely. And at the eastern end of that impossible highway, where mile marker 397 should mark the end of the road, there's something waiting. Something that's been collecting people for 47 years, adding them to a procession that grows longer with each passing season. The knocking on my door is getting more insistent now. I can hear Patricia Wells calling my name, along with voices I recognize from decades past. Helen Morrison, Sarah Williams, Dorothy Chen, Betty Walsh, all the women whose bodies I found in those woods, speaking in perfect unison, their voices carrying clearly through the walls of my house. "Officer Hayes," they're saying, "it's time to come home. The highway misses you. We've saved you a place in the procession." I know I should be afraid, but strangely I'm not. After 47 years of nightmares and guilt and unanswered questions, there's something almost peaceful about finally understanding what this has all been leading to. I was never just a cop who stumbled onto a crime scene. I was chosen, just like Patterson was chosen, just like Detective Wells was chosen.
The only difference is that my role was to find the bodies, to make sure the victims were discovered and their transformations could be completed. Every time I followed those radio transmissions to a burial site, I was participating in something ancient and terrible, something that needed witnesses to make it real. And now my part is done. The highway has enough servants, enough runners, enough voices to guide the next generation of recruits. It's time for me to join the procession that's been waiting for me all these years. I can see them now, standing in my front yard. 137 women in white dresses, their faces glowing with an inner light that has nothing to do with this world. And in front of them, smiling that impossible smile, is Detective Patricia Wells. "We're going home, Mr. Hayes," she calls through my window. "All of us together. The highway is complete now. The circle is closed." She's right, of course. The circle is closed. It began with me finding Helen Morrison's body in 1976, and it's ending with me joining her procession in 2023. 47 years of faithful service, 47 years of answering the call when the radio crackled with desperate voices. The doorknob is turning now. They're coming inside. I can smell something like ozone and old asphalt, and I can hear the sound of running feet on an endless highway. The highway that leads everywhere and nowhere. The highway that never ends. Route 17 is calling my name, and after all these years, I'm finally ready to answer. The woman in white stopped running 47 years ago, but she never stopped recruiting. And now, finally, her work is done. The highway is complete. Population, everyone who ever tried to help. Welcome to Route 17. Next stop, everywhere and nowhere. The journey never ends, but that's the best part. No rush, no pressure, no deadlines. Just the highway, forever and ever. And if you're reading this, if you've made it this far through my story, then you've already heard the call. You've already been chosen. The highway knows who you are now, knows where to find you. Don't fight it when they come knocking. The resistance only makes the transformation more painful. Just remember that every ending is a new beginning, and every beginning is an ending. The highway accommodates all travelers, dead or alive. Though the distinction becomes less important the farther you go. See you on Route 17. The woman in white will be waiting to show you the way home. I never wanted to be a cop. That might sound strange coming from someone who spent 22 years with the New York State Highway Patrol, but it's the truth. I wanted to be a teacher, maybe work with kids who needed someone to believe in them. But life has a way of making decisions for you, and sometimes those decisions lead you down roads you never intended to travel. My name is William Carter, and I'm telling you this story because I can't take it to my grave. What happened during the winter of 1978 on the back roads of northern New York changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about death, about the thin line that separates the living from whatever comes after. The department buried the case files, the newspapers never picked up the story, and everyone involved was transferred or retired within 2 years. But the truth has a way of demanding to be told, even if it takes 45 years to find someone willing to listen. I became a highway patrol officer in 1971 because my father died of a heart attack when I was 22, leaving my mother with medical bills that would have bankrupted a small country. The state police offered steady pay, good benefits, and a pension that would keep food on the table. It wasn't the career I'd dreamed of, but it was honest work that served a purpose. At least that's what I told myself during those first few years when every traffic stop felt like a betrayal of who I was supposed to be. By 1978, I'd been working the Northern District long enough to know every mile of highway between Albany and the Canadian border. It's lonely country up there, especially in winter when the snow piles 10 feet deep and the temperatures drop so low that exposed skin freezes in minutes. The kind of place where a broken-down car can become a death sentence, where helping a stranded motorist isn't just good police work. It's the difference between someone going home to their family or becoming another statistic in the state's hypothermia files. The Adirondack region has always attracted a certain type of person: hunters who disappear into the woods for weeks at a time, survivalists who build cabins 50 miles from the nearest road, artists and writers looking for inspiration in the wilderness, and occasionally people running from something they can't face in the civilized world. Most of them are harmless enough, just folks who prefer trees to people and silence to the constant noise of modern life. But some of them are running from things that are better left alone. December 1978 was the beginning of what the Weather Service would later call the worst winter in New York history. By Christmas, we'd already had 3 major blizzards that closed I-87 for days at a time. The temperature hadn't risen above zero in over 2 weeks, and the wind chill was regularly hitting 40 below. The kind of cold that kills car batteries, splits water pipes, and turns human flesh into frozen meat in minutes. I was 31 years old that Christmas Eve, unmarried and scheduled to work the night shift while the married officers spent time with their families. It wasn't a hardship. I'd volunteered for holiday duty every year since joining the force. Christmas had never meant much to me anyway, not since my father died. And someone had to be out there on the highways, watching for drunk drivers and helping stranded motorists who'd underestimated how dangerous winter travel could be in upstate New York. The shift started routinely enough. I'd begun my patrol at 10 p.m., checking in with dispatch and reviewing the weather reports that predicted another 6 inches of snow before dawn. The roads were mostly empty. Sensible people were home by their fireplaces, not driving through a blizzard on Christmas Eve. But there's always someone who thinks the weather warnings don't apply to them. Someone who absolutely has to get somewhere regardless of conditions. By midnight, I'd responded to 2 minor fender benders caused by icy roads and helped push a family's station wagon out of a snowbank near the Warrensburg exit. Standard winter patrol duty. The kind of calls that reminded me why I'd stayed with the job despite never really wanting it. Sometimes you got to be the person who made the difference between a minor inconvenience and a major tragedy. Around 1 a.m., I was northbound on I-87, about 20 miles south of the Canadian border, when dispatch called with what would be my last routine assignment of the night. Unit 23, we've got a motorist assistance request on Route 3 westbound, approximately 12 miles west of the Saranac Lake exit. Caller reported a vehicle that's been stranded on the shoulder for several hours. No contact with the driver. Route 3 was one of the loneliest stretches of highway in my district. A 2-lane road that wound through dense forest and small mountain communities that became completely isolated during major snowstorms. The kind of road where you might not see another car for hours, especially in weather like this. Unit 23 responding. I radioed back. What's the nature of the stranded vehicle? Caller described it as a dark sedan, possibly a Buick or Oldsmobile, mid-70s model. Hazard lights were on when first spotted around 10 p.m., but the caller was heading the opposite direction and couldn't stop safely. Made the report when he reached Tupper Lake. That meant the vehicle had potentially been stranded for over 3 hours in sub-zero temperatures. If someone was trapped inside without heat, they might already be dead from hypothermia. If they'd tried to walk for help, they definitely were. Copy? Dispatch. ETA approximately 25 minutes. The drive to Route 3 took me through some of the most isolated country in New York State. Dense forests of pine and maple that stretched for miles without interruption, broken only by the occasional hunting camp or seasonal cabin. During the summer, it was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. During winter storms like this, it was a frozen wasteland that could swallow a person without a trace. I turned onto Route 3 around 1:30 a.m. and immediately understood why the caller hadn't been able to stop. The road was covered with a layer of ice underneath the fresh snow, and the wind was creating drifts that made it difficult to distinguish the highway from the surrounding forest. My patrol car's all-wheel drive and winter tires were the only things keeping me on the road. I'd driven about 10 miles when I spotted the stranded vehicle. It was a 1974 Buick LeSabre, dark green, sitting on the right shoulder with its hazard lights still blinking weakly. The car was nearly buried in snow that had drifted against the passenger side, and ice had formed on all the windows thick enough to make it impossible to see inside. I pulled over about 30 feet behind the Buick and activated my emergency lights, then grabbed my heavy winter gear from the back seat. The temperature outside was at least 25 below zero, and the wind chill would make it feel even colder. I'd learned early in my career that winter rescues in the Adirondacks required proper preparation. People died up here because they weren't ready for how quickly conditions could turn deadly. As I approached the Buick, I could see that the engine was off and the interior was dark. No signs of movement inside, which wasn't necessarily a bad sign. People trapped in cars during blizzards often huddled under blankets or in sleeping bags to conserve body heat. But something about the scene bothered me, though I couldn't immediately identify what it was. I knocked on the driver's side window with my flashlight. "New York Highway Patrol, anyone in there?" No response. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was unusual. Most people lock their cars automatically, even when stranded. The door opened with a crack of breaking ice, and my flashlight beam illuminated the interior. The car was empty. No driver, no passengers, no personal belongings that would indicate who the car belonged to or where they might have gone. The keys were still in the ignition, and the fuel gauge showed a quarter tank of gas. Enough to keep the engine running for hours if someone had been trying to stay warm. I checked the glove compartment and found the registration. The car belonged to Dorothy Brennan, age 34, with an address in Schenectady. According to the paperwork, the car was properly registered and insured. But there was no sign of Dorothy Brennan anywhere. I radioed dispatch with my findings. Unit 23 to dispatch. I'm at the location of the stranded vehicle. Car is empty, keys in ignition, no sign of the driver. Registration shows the vehicle belongs to Dorothy Brennan of Schenectady, requesting you run a check on the registered owner. Copy, Unit 23. Stand by. While I waited for dispatch to get back to me, I began searching the area around the car for any clues about where Dorothy Brennan might have gone. The snow was too deep and the wind too strong for footprints to be visible, but there were other signs I could look for. Broken branches that might indicate someone had tried to walk through the forest, or disturbed snow that might show the direction they'd headed. What I found instead was much more disturbing. About 20 yards behind the Buick, partially hidden in a grove of pine trees, was another car. A 1975 Ford Granada, buried up to its windows in snow but with enough of the roof visible to show that it had been there for much longer than a few hours. Days, maybe even weeks. I approached the second vehicle carefully, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Like the Buick, this car's doors were unlocked and the interior was empty. But, unlike the Buick, this car showed signs of a struggle. The driver's seat was pushed back as far as it would go, as if someone had been trying to get away from something in the passenger area. The glove compartment was open and its contents scattered across the floor. The registration for the Ford was made out to Richard Stone, age 42, from Albany. The car had been reported stolen 3 weeks earlier, according to the paperwork I found in the glove compartment, along with what looked like a police report. My radio crackled to life with a response from dispatch. Unit 23. Be advised that Dorothy Brennan was reported missing by her family 2 days ago. She was driving to Montreal to spend Christmas with relatives and never arrived. Her family contacted RCMP when she failed to show up as scheduled. Copy, dispatch. I've located a second vehicle at this location, Ford Granada, registered to Richard Stone of Albany. Appears to have been here for an extended period. There was a pause before dispatch responded. Unit 23. Richard Stone was reported missing 3 weeks ago. His vehicle was reported stolen, but it was assumed he had taken it himself. He was wanted for questioning in connection with several burglaries in the Albany area. 2 missing persons, 2 abandoned cars,
both found on the same isolated stretch of highway in the middle of the Adirondack wilderness. The coincidence was too significant to ignore, but it raised more questions than it answered. What had happened to Dorothy Brennan and Richard Stone? Why had they both abandoned their vehicles in the same remote location? And if they were both dead, where were the bodies? I was starting to radio for backup when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, but unmistakably human. Someone was singing. The voice was coming from deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards from the highway. It was a woman's voice, singing what sounded like a Christmas carol, but the words were distorted by the wind and distance. I stopped and listened, trying to make out the lyrics, but all I could catch were fragments. Silent night, holy night, all is calm. "Hello?" I called out into the darkness. "New York Highway Patrol. If someone's out there, respond." The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of wind through the trees. I waited for a response, but heard nothing except the natural sounds of the forest. Then, just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, the singing resumed. Closer this time, and clearer. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. It was definitely a woman's voice, and it was definitely coming from somewhere in the forest ahead of me. But there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The voice was too clear, too steady for someone who should have been suffering from hypothermia and exposure. And there was an quality to it that I couldn't identify, something that sounded almost mechanical. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of waiting for backup, instead of following protocol and staying with the vehicles until other units arrived, I decided to follow the voice into the forest. Someone was out there in the cold, possibly Dorothy Brennan, and they needed help. In weather like this, every minute could be the difference between life and death. I grabbed my emergency pack from the patrol car and headed into the trees, following the sound of the singing. The snow was waist-deep in places, and my progress was slow and exhausting. Every few steps I'd stop and listen, trying to keep track of the voice's location. It seemed to be moving deeper into the forest, always staying just far enough ahead that I couldn't quite catch up. "Ma'am," I called out. "Stop moving. I'm here to help you." But the singing continued, drawing me deeper into the wilderness. After about 15 minutes of difficult hiking, I realized I could no longer see the lights from my patrol car. The forest had swallowed me completely, and the only illumination came from my flashlight beam cutting through the swirling snow. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small and primitive, the kind of structure that hunters built for temporary shelter during deer season. But this one looked like it had been occupied for an extended period. There was smoke coming from a chimney pipe, and warm light glowed through windows that had been covered with what looked like heavy blankets or tarps. The singing was coming from inside the cabin. I approached carefully, my hand resting on the grip of my service weapon. The situation was starting to feel wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Who lived in a cabin this deep in the wilderness during the worst winter storm in decades? And why did the singing sound so off? Through a gap in one of the window coverings, I could see inside. The cabin was lit by kerosene lamps and a wood-burning stove that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And sitting in a chair near the stove, her back to the window, was a woman with long blonde hair. She was singing Silent Night in a clear, steady voice, but something about her posture was wrong. She sat too straight, too still, like a mannequin posed in a department store display. And her hair wasn't moving despite the drafts that should have been coming through the gaps in the cabin's primitive construction. I knocked on the cabin door. "Ma'am, New York Highway Patrol, are you all right in there?" The singing stopped immediately.
For a moment there was complete silence except for the wind through the trees. Then I heard footsteps approaching the door from inside. "Come in," a woman's voice called out. "The door's not locked." I opened the door carefully and stepped inside. The warmth hit me immediately after the sub-zero cold outside, and I had to blink several times as my eyes adjusted to the lamplight. The woman was still sitting in her chair by the stove, but now she was facing me. It was Dorothy Brennan. I recognized her from the driver's license photo I'd found in her car. But something was terribly wrong with her appearance. Her skin was blue-white, the color of advanced frostbite, and her eyes were glassy and unfocused. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on when she'd left Schenectady 3 days earlier, a light jacket and jeans that would have been completely inadequate for survival in this weather. "You're late," she said, and smiled with lips that were almost black from cold damage. "I've been waiting for you." "Ma'am, my name is Officer Carter with the New York Highway Patrol. Your family reported you missing. We need to get you medical attention immediately." "I don't need medical attention," she replied, still smiling that horrible smile. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That's when I noticed the smell. Underneath the wood smoke and kerosene fumes was something else. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of decomposition, of flesh that had been dead for days. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me back to my patrol car. You're suffering from severe hypothermia, and you need to get to a hospital." "Hypothermia?" She repeated the word like she was tasting it. "Yes, that's what killed me. 3 days ago, when my car broke down and I tried to walk for help, I made it about a mile before the cold took me." I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "Ma'am, you're confused. You're sitting right here talking to me. You're not dead." "Aren't I?" She stood up from the chair, and that's when I saw that her feet weren't quite touching the floor. She was floating maybe an inch above the cabin's rough wooden boards, her body swaying slightly like she was suspended from invisible strings. "I died in the snow about a quarter mile from here," she continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that reminded me of the Christmas carol she'd been singing. "The cold took me slowly, piece by piece. First my fingers and toes, then my hands and feet, then my arms and legs. Finally my heart stopped, and I fell into the snow and didn't get up again." I was backing toward the door now, my hand on my weapon, but I couldn't bring myself to draw it. What was I going to shoot? And even if I did, would it accomplish anything? "But I didn't stay dead," Dorothy continued, floating closer to me. "Something in these woods doesn't let the dead rest. Something that feeds on the cold and the isolation and the fear of people who die alone in the wilderness. Something that's been here since before the first Europeans arrived, since before the native tribes gave this place a name." "You're hallucinating," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. "Hypothermia causes confusion and delusions. We need to get you warm and... Look around, Officer Carter. Really look." I swept my flashlight beam around the cabin, and that's when I saw them. Sitting in chairs arranged around the room were 4 other people, 3 men and a woman, all with the same blue-white skin and glassy eyes as Dorothy, all wearing clothes that were completely inadequate for winter weather, all floating slightly above their seats. One of them was Richard Stone. I recognized him from the mugshot that had been circulated when he was reported missing. The others were strangers, but they all had the same look, the look of people who had died from exposure and somehow kept going anyway. "We've been waiting for you," Dorothy said. "All of us. We knew someone would come eventually, someone who would try to help, someone who would care enough to follow a voice into the woods on a night like this." "What do you want?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "We want you to join us," she replied. We want you to understand what it's like to die slowly from the cold, to feel your body shutting down piece by piece while your mind remains clear enough to experience every moment of it. We want you to know what it's like to realize that death isn't the end, that some places trap souls the way spider webs trap flies. The other figures were standing now, all of them floating slightly above the floor, all of them moving toward me with that same slow, deliberate motion. I could see their breath misting in the air despite the heat from the wood stove, as if their bodies were still frozen inside. The thing that lives in these woods has been feeding for centuries, Dorothy continued. Native Americans knew about it and avoided this area during winter months. Early settlers who built cabins here disappeared and were never found. Hunters and hikers who got lost in the snow would walk in circles until they froze to death, then join the collection of souls that can never leave. I was pressed against the cabin door now, fumbling for the handle while keeping my flashlight trained on the approaching figures. This isn't real. You're all dead. This is just some kind of hallucination brought on by the cold. Is it? Dorothy asked, and suddenly she was inches away from my face, her frozen features twisted into a mockery of human expression. Then why can you smell our decay? Why can you feel the cold radiating from our bodies? Why does every instinct you have tell you to run? I found the door handle and yanked it open, stumbling backward into the snow. The figures followed me out of the cabin, moving in that same eerie floating motion, their feet never quite touching the ground. Behind them, the cabin began to fade and flicker like a mirage, revealing the truth underneath. There was no cabin. There never had been. Just a small clearing in the forest where 5 bodies sat frozen in the snow, arranged in a rough circle around the blackened remains of a campfire. Their eyes were open and staring, their mouths frozen in expressions of terror and confusion, and somehow, impossibly, they were all looking at me. "Welcome to our collection," Dorothy's voice said, though her frozen lips didn't move. "You'll find that death is just the beginning here. The cold preserves everything: flesh, consciousness, suffering. We've been waiting so long for someone new to join us." I ran. I dropped my flashlight and my emergency pack and ran through the deep snow as fast as my legs could carry me, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not the sound of footsteps in snow, but something else, like wind moving through dead leaves. By some miracle, I found my way back to the highway. My patrol car was exactly where I'd left it, its emergency lights still flashing and its engine still running. I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors, then grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Unit 23 to dispatch, emergency." "Go ahead, Unit 23. I need backup and medical response at my location immediately. Multiple deceased individuals discovered in the forest. Possible exposure deaths." "Copy, Unit 23. Units are responding. What's your current status?" I looked back toward the tree line where I'd emerged from the forest. 5 figures stood at the edge of the woods, clearly visible in my headlights. They weren't moving, just standing and watching, their pale faces turned toward my patrol car. Even from 50 yards away, I could see Dorothy Brennan in the center of the group, still wearing that horrible smile. "Unit 23, please respond. What's your current status?" I'm all right," I managed to say. "Just get the backup units here as soon as possible." But I wasn't all right. I haven't been all right since that night in 1978. Because as I sat in my patrol car waiting for backup to arrive, watching those 5 figures standing motionless at the edge of the forest, I realized something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was cold, bone-deep, penetrating cold that seemed to come from inside my body rather than from the winter air. And no matter how high I turned up the heat in my patrol car, no matter how many blankets I wrapped around myself, I couldn't get warm. The backup units arrived 20 minutes later. 2 patrol cars and an ambulance, their emergency lights cutting through the darkness like red and blue strobes. When the other officers approached my car, I pointed toward the tree line where the figures had been standing. There was nothing there. "Carter, what the hell happened to you?" Sergeant Harold Novak asked when he saw my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "There are bodies in the forest," I said. 5 people who died from exposure, about a quarter-mile into the trees, in a small clearing. We organized a search party and spent the next 4 hours combing the forest. We found the 2 abandoned cars, exactly where I'd described them. We found my dropped flashlight and emergency pack, but we never found any bodies, any clearing, or any sign that anyone had died in those woods. The official report stated that Dorothy Brennan and Richard Stone had abandoned their vehicles and presumably hitchhiked or walked to safety. Their cases remained open as missing persons investigations, but no further evidence was ever discovered. The other 3 people I'd seen in the forest were never identified, and no additional missing persons reports matched their descriptions. I was reassigned to a different district a month later, officially for personal reasons, but really because I couldn't stop talking about what I'd seen that night. The department psychologist diagnosed me with stress-related hallucinations brought on by isolation and extreme weather conditions. I was required to undergo counseling and take a leave of absence before returning to duty. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The cold that had settled into my bones that night never fully went away. Even now, 45 years later, living in a retirement community in Florida where the temperature never drops below 60 degrees, I can still feel it. A deep, penetrating chill that reminds me every day that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Over the years, I've done research on the area where I encountered Dorothy Brennan and the others. The records go back to the 1700s, when French fur trappers reported strange disappearances in the region during winter months. Native American oral histories describe the area as cursed, a place where the spirits of those who die from cold are trapped forever. In 1823, a settler named Thomas Mackenzie built a cabin in the same general area where I'd seen the Phantom building. His family was found frozen to death the following spring, arranged in a circle around their cold fireplace, as if they'd been sitting and waiting for something. The cabin was abandoned and eventually collapsed, but local hunters continued to report strange sightings in the area for decades. During the Great Depression, a family of 5 was found frozen in their car after becoming stranded on Route 3 during a blizzard. Their bodies were arranged in the same circular pattern, and witnesses reported that their eyes remained open and seemed to track movement even after death was confirmed. In 1954, a search and rescue team looking for a missing hiker found him frozen solid in a standing position, his arms outstretched as if he was directing an orchestra. The rescue team reported that his lips were moving silently, as if he was trying to speak, even though he'd been dead for days. The pattern repeats every few years. People disappear during winter storms in that particular section of the Adirondacks. Some are never found. Others are discovered in impossible positions, frozen but somehow still aware, their eyes tracking the movements of anyone who approaches them. And sometimes, on nights when the temperature drops below 0 and the wind howls through the mountains like a living thing, hikers and snowmobilers report hearing voices in the forest. Christmas carols sung in perfect harmony by a choir that died decades ago, calling out to anyone foolish enough to follow the sound into the darkness. I retired from the New York Highway Patrol in 1993. 22 years after that night in the forest changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. I moved to Florida the next year, hoping that distance and warm weather would help me forget. But you can't run from some things, and you can't forget experiences that fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. The cold follows me everywhere. Not just the physical cold. That would be manageable. It's the spiritual cold, the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains of upstate New York, 5 people who died from exposure are still waiting for someone new to join their eternal winter. still singing Christmas carols to lure rescuers into the forest, still collecting souls for whatever ancient thing feeds on isolation and despair. Last winter, 44 years after my encounter with Dorothy Brennan, I received a phone call from a young officer with the New York Highway Patrol. His name was Detective James Peterson, and he was investigating a series of disappearances along Route 3 in the Adirondacks. 7 people had vanished during winter storms over the past 5 years, all under circumstances similar to what I'd experienced in 1978. "I found your name in some old case files," he told me. "You responded to a missing persons call involving Dorothy Brennan and Richard Stone. I was hoping you might remember some details that didn't make it into the official reports." I told him the truth. All of it. The phantom cabin, the dead who wouldn't stay dead, the ancient evil that trapped souls in eternal winter. I expected him to hang up or dismiss me as a crazy old man suffering from dementia. Instead, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Carter, I think I need to drive down to Florida and talk to you in person." He arrived the next day, a serious young man with tired eyes and the kind of deep exhaustion that comes from seeing things you can't explain or forget. Over coffee in my kitchen, he told me about his own encounters with the impossible. 3 months earlier, he'd responded to a call about a stranded motorist on Route 3. He'd found an abandoned car, but no driver, just like I had in 1978. Following protocol, he'd searched the surrounding area and discovered what appeared to be a hunting cabin deep in the forest. Inside the cabin, he'd found a man sitting by a wood stove, apparently suffering from hypothermia. But when Peterson tried to help the man, he realized that the person was dead. Had been dead for days, according to the medical examiner's later report. Yet the body had been warm to the touch, and Peterson swore that the man had spoken to him, had tried to convince him to stay in the cabin until the storm passed. "The thing is," Peterson said, stirring sugar into his coffee with hands that shook slightly, "I checked the records. That cabin burned down in 1962. There's nothing left of it but a foundation and some charred timbers. But I saw it, Mr. Carter. I was inside it. I felt the heat from the stove." Since then, Peterson had been investigating similar reports from other officers in the region. Always the same pattern: stranded motorists whose cars were found empty, search parties that discovered impossible buildings occupied by people who had died from exposure, voices in the forest that led rescuers deeper into the wilderness until they barely escaped with their lives. "How many?" I asked him. "Officially, 7 missing persons over the past 5 years. Unofficially, I think it's been going on a lot longer than that. I found reports going back to the 1800s that match the same pattern. People who disappear during winter storms, phantom buildings that appear and disappear, voices singing in the forest." "And how many officers have experienced what you and I went through?" Peterson was quiet for a moment. "At least a dozen that I know of. Most of them requested transfers to different districts within a year. A few retired early. One had a complete nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for 6 months." "What are you going to do with this information?" "I don't know," he admitted. "How do you write a report about something like this? How do you warn people about a threat that officially doesn't exist?" I didn't have an answer for him then, and I don't have one now. How do you protect people from something that exists in the spaces between life and death, something that feeds on isolation and despair, and the very human instinct to help others in need? All I know is that the thing in the Adirondack wilderness is still there, still collecting souls for its eternal winter collection, still using the voices of the dead to lure rescuers into the forest, still growing stronger with each person who dies from exposure in its territory. Detective Peterson returned to New York after our meeting, determined to find some way to warn other officers about what they might encounter on winter rescue calls in the mountains. 6 months later, I received a phone call from his supervisor. Peterson had disappeared while responding to a missing persons call on Route 3. His patrol car was found abandoned on the shoulder, engine running, doors unlocked. There was no sign of him anywhere. The search parties that looked for Peterson reported hearing voices in the forest. A man's voice calling for help, leading them deeper into the wilderness. But they never found him, just like they never found Dorothy Brennan or Richard Stone or any of the others who vanished into that cursed stretch of mountains. But sometimes, on the coldest nights of the year, hikers in the Adirondacks report hearing something new in the forest. Along with the Christmas carols sung by Dorothy Brennan's Choir of the Dead, there's now a man's voice calling out police radio codes and procedure numbers, as if he's trying to direct a rescue operation that will never end. The collection grows larger every year. The ancient evil that feeds on winter and isolation and human suffering continues to harvest souls, using the very compassion that makes us human as bait to lure new victims into its trap. And I'm running out of time to warn people about what's waiting for them in those dark woods. The cold that entered my bones that night in 1978 has been spreading slowly through my body for 45 years. My doctors call it arthritis, circulatory problems, the natural result of aging. But I know better. The thing in the forest marked me that night, claimed me as part of its collection. It's been patient, letting me live my life while slowly drawing me back into its influence. But patience has limits, even for ancient evils, and mine is running out. Last night, for the first time since 1978, I heard Dorothy Brennan's voice, not in a dream or a memory, but clearly and distinctly, coming from the darkness outside my bedroom window. "Officer Carter," she sang in that horrible, sweet voice, "it's time to come home. We've been waiting for you for so long. We've saved you a place in our circle." I looked out the window and saw them standing in my backyard, clearly visible despite the Florida humidity and 80-degree temperature. 5 figures in winter clothes that should have been unbearable in the subtropical heat, their breath misting in the warm air as if they were still trapped in that frozen forest 45 years ago. Dorothy Brennan stood in the center of the group, still wearing that light jacket and jeans, still floating slightly above the ground. She raised her hand and waved at me, smiling that black-lipped smile that had haunted my nightmares for decades. "The collection is almost complete," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the glass and the humid air. "Just one more soul, and we can rest. Just one more voice for our eternal choir." I'm writing this story as fast as I can, trying to get it all down before they come for me. Because I know they will come. The thing in the Adirondack wilderness doesn't let its marked souls escape forever, no matter how far they run or how long they hide. The cold is spreading through my body faster now, turning my blood to ice and my breath to frost despite the Florida heat. My fingers are turning blue-white as I type these words, and I can feel my heart slowing down with each beat. But maybe, if I can get this story finished and posted online before they take me, someone will read it. Someone will understand the warning and stay away from Route 3 during winter storms. Someone will tell other police officers to be careful when they hear voices calling for help in the Adirondack wilderness. Because the dead don't stay dead in those mountains. They join something older and hungrier than human understanding, something that has been feeding on winter deaths for centuries. And once you've seen them, once you've heard their voices and felt their cold touch, you become part of their collection, whether you want to or not. The temperature in my house is dropping now, even though the thermostat shows 85 degrees. Ice is forming on the inside of my windows, and I can see my breath when I exhale. They're bringing their eternal winter with them, extending the boundaries of their frozen kingdom to reach across 1,000 miles and 45 years to claim what has always belonged to them. I can hear them outside now, all of them. Not just Dorothy Brennan and the original 5, but dozens of voices. Everyone who has died from exposure in the Adirondacks over the past century. Everyone who has been added to the collection since that cursed place began claiming souls. They're singing Christmas carols in perfect harmony, their voices rising and falling like wind through dead trees. Detective Peterson's voice is among them now, calling out radio codes and procedure numbers in a steady monotone that blends with the singing. He's trying to warn other officers, just like Dorothy tried to warn me. But the warning and the trap are the same thing. You can't hear their voices without being marked for collection. The front door is opening now. I didn't unlock it, but locks mean nothing to the dead. They're coming inside, bringing their winter with them, trailing snow and ice and the smell of frozen flesh. The carpet is crunching under their feet as if it's covered with frost, and the walls are turning white with ice crystals. Dorothy Brennan is leading them, still wearing that horrible smile, still floating inches above the floor. Behind her come Richard Stone and the three others from that night in 1978, followed by Peterson and dozens of faces I don't recognize. All of them with that same blue-white skin, all of them breathing out clouds of frozen air, all of them reaching toward me with hands that are black from frostbite. "Time to go home, Officer Carter," Dorothy says, and her voice sounds like wind through an ice cave. "Time to take your place in the circle. Time to join our eternal winter patrol." I can feel the cold taking me now, spreading through my chest and into my heart. My vision is blurring as ice crystals form on my eyes, and my fingers are too stiff to keep typing. But I need to finish this. Need to get the warning out before they complete their collection. If you're reading this, if you're a police officer or emergency responder or anyone who might be called to help stranded motorists in the Adirondack region of New York, please remember what I'm telling you. When you hear voices calling for help in the winter forest, don't follow them. When you find abandoned cars on Route 3 during blizzards, call for backup and wait for assistance. When you see buildings that shouldn't exist occupied by people who should be dead, turn around and walk away. The thing that lives in those mountains feeds on compassion, on the human instinct to help others in need. It uses our best qualities against us, turning our desire to save lives into a trap that costs us our souls. It's been doing this for centuries, and it will keep doing it for centuries more unless someone finds a way to stop it. But I don't think it can be stopped. I think it's too old, too rooted in the landscape, too much a part of the winter itself to be destroyed by human effort. All we can do is avoid it, warn others about it, and hope that knowledge will be enough to keep more souls from being added to its collection. The cold is in my heart now, slowing my pulse to match the rhythm of the singing that surrounds me. I can feel my consciousness fading as the ice spreads through my brain, freezing my thoughts and memories into crystalline formations that will last forever in the eternal winter of the Adirondack dead. Dorothy Brennan is standing beside my chair now, reaching out to take my hand with fingers that are white as bone and cold as mountain snow. When she touches me, I'll become like them, dead but not departed, conscious but not alive, forever trapped in the space between worlds where winter never ends. "Welcome home," she whispers, and her breath turns to ice crystals that fall like snow onto my keyboard. "Welcome to the patrol that never ends." I can see the others now, all of them arranged in a circle around my chair like they were arranged around that phantom campfire in 1978. Richard Stone and the three unknowns from the original collection. Detective Peterson with his police radio still crackling with static. Dozens of others whose names I'll never know, all claimed by the winter over the decades and centuries. And in the center of the circle, something else. Something that isn't human and never was. Something made of ice and shadow and hunger that feeds on the cold deaths of winter travelers. It's beautiful in a terrible way, like a blizzard or an avalanche.
a force of nature that cares nothing for human life or suffering, but commands a kind of awful respect. This is what has been calling the shots all along, what has been using the voices of the dead to lure new victims into its web. Not Dorothy Brennan or any of the others. They're just tools, instruments in an orchestra conducted by something far older and more alien than human understanding. It speaks without words, communicating directly with the frozen remnants of my consciousness. It tells me about the bargain that governs its existence, the ancient pact that allows it to claim the souls of those who die from cold in its territory. It explains that death is not the end, but a transformation, a recruitment into an eternal service that spans generations. The dead become its agents, using their human appearance and familiar voices to lure new victims into the wilderness. They retain enough of their original personalities to be convincing, enough of their humanity to trigger the compassionate responses that make rescue workers vulnerable. But they serve the winter thing now, adding new voices to its choir of the damned. I understand now why Dorothy and the others looked so satisfied when I encountered them in 1978. They weren't suffering. They were recruiting. They had found their purpose in death, their role in something greater than their individual existence. They were part of an ancient system that transformed human tragedy into supernatural sustenance. And now I'm joining them. I can feel my body temperature dropping to match the ambient cold that surrounds the circle of the dead. My heart is slowing, my breathing becoming shallow and irregular, my consciousness crystallizing into the clear, cold awareness that characterizes the winter's servants. But before the transformation is complete, before I lose the last vestiges of my human perspective, I need to finish this warning. Because even though I'm about to become one of them, even though I'll soon be using my own voice to lure other rescuers into the trap, some part of me wants to give people a fighting chance. The thing feeds on isolation and despair as much as it feeds on cold deaths. It chooses victims who are alone, cut off from help, vulnerable to the psychological manipulation that its servants employ. But knowledge is power, and understanding the nature of the threat might be enough to help some people resist its influence. If you encounter stranded motorists in the Adirondack wilderness during winter storms, bring backup. Lots of backup. Work in teams, maintain radio contact, and set strict time limits for search operations. Don't let anyone go into the forest alone, no matter how urgent the situation seems. If you hear voices calling for help in the woods, assume they're not human until proven otherwise. Use thermal imaging equipment if you have it. The dead don't generate body heat, even when they appear to be warm and alive. And if you encounter people who seem unaffected by sub-zero temperatures, people who float slightly above the ground or whose breath mists in warm air, don't engage with them. Retreat immediately and call for specialized assistance. Most importantly, don't trust your compassion in these situations. The thing that lives in the Adirondack wilderness has turned human kindness into a weapon, using our desire to help others as bait for its trap. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is walk away from someone who appears to need help. I know that goes against every instinct that drives people to become police officers or emergency responders. We're trained to put others' needs ahead of our own safety, to risk our lives for strangers, to never abandon someone who might be saved. But in the case of the Adirondack Winter Collection, those instincts will get you killed, or worse, recruited into an eternal service that spans centuries. The cold is taking my fingers now, turning them white and stiff as I struggle to type these final words. Dorothy Brennan is humming Silent Night beside my chair, and the sound is beautiful in a way that terrifies me. I want to join in, to add my voice to the harmony that echoes through the frozen wilderness of upstate New York. But I'm fighting it for just a few more seconds, long enough to share one last piece of information that might help future investigators understand what they're dealing with.
In my research over the years, I found references to similar phenomena in other parts of the world. Places where extreme cold and isolation create conditions for this type of supernatural predation. The Siberian wilderness has legends of ice spirits that collect the souls of travelers who freeze to death in the taiga. The Canadian Arctic has Inuit stories about things that use the voices of the dead to lure hunters away from their communities. The mountains of Alaska and northern Scandinavia have their own versions of the winter collection, ancient entities that feed on hypothermia deaths and recruit the frozen dead as servants. This isn't unique to New York. It's a worldwide phenomenon, a type of predator that exists wherever winter cold can kill and geographic isolation provides hunting grounds. The Adirondack entity is just one member of a species that may be as old as ice itself, as eternal as winter, as patient as the slow accumulation of snow that eventually becomes glaciers. Understanding this might help researchers develop better strategies for dealing with these entities. Maybe there are ways to disrupt their ability to create phantom buildings or mimic human voices. Maybe there are frequencies or technologies that can reveal their true nature. Maybe there are protective measures that can shield potential victims from their psychological influence. But I'll never know if such countermeasures are possible, because my time as a human investigator is ending. The ice has reached my heart now, and I can feel the last warmth draining from my body as the winter thing completes its claim on my soul. My consciousness is crystallizing into something new, something that serves the eternal cold rather than fighting against it. I can see through different eyes now, with the perspective of something that exists outside normal space and time. The boundaries between life and death, between warm and cold, between rescue and recruitment, are blurring as I take my place in the circle of the collected. The others are welcoming me with smiles that are no longer horrible, but beautiful, expressions of joy at gaining a new member for their eternal choir. Dorothy Brennan takes my hand, and her touch doesn't hurt anymore. It feels like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "Now you understand," she says, and her voice sounds like wind chimes made of ice. "Now you see why we do what we do. Death isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a different kind of existence, a purpose that transcends individual mortality." She's right, of course. I can see it all now. The grand design that spans centuries, the careful cultivation of conditions that allow the winter thing to feed and grow stronger. Every soul added to the collection makes it more powerful, more capable of extending its influence across greater distances and longer periods of time. We are its antibodies, its immune system, defending it against threats while simultaneously recruiting new members to strengthen its capabilities. We use our retained humanity to make the transformation seem appealing rather than terrifying, to present eternal service as salvation rather than damnation. And the beautiful part is that it really is salvation, in a way. Death from hypothermia is agonizing. The slow shutdown of body systems, the confusion and helplessness, the gradual fading of consciousness into nothingness. But joining the collection preserves awareness while eliminating suffering, granting a form of immortality that allows us to continue serving a purpose. I'm standing now, though I don't remember getting up from my chair. My body feels light and graceful, unencumbered by the physical limitations that plagued me in life. I can feel the winter thing's approval washing over me like a cold wind, welcoming me into its service. The others are forming a circle around me, preparing for the ritual that will complete my transformation from human to servant. Detective Peterson approaches with a New York Highway Patrol radio in his hands, its speakers crackling with the voices of dispatchers and officers who have no idea what's coming for them. "Your new assignment," he says, offering me the radio. "Winter patrol duty in the Adirondack wilderness. Every storm brings new opportunities for recruitment. Every stranded motorist is a potential addition to our collection." I take the radio and immediately understand my role in the grand design. I'll use my knowledge of police procedures and protocols to make our recruiting efforts more effective. I'll help create scenarios that draw officers into the wilderness during dangerous weather conditions. I'll use my voice to call in false emergency reports that lead rescue workers into our territory. But even as I accept my new existence, even as I feel the satisfaction of joining something larger than myself, a small part of my human consciousness rebels against what I'm becoming. That part screams warnings about the trap I've fallen into, the way compassion and duty have been weaponized against the very people who dedicate their lives to helping others. It's that rebellious part of my mind that forced me to write this account, that drove me to warn others about the fate that awaits them in the frozen wilderness of upstate New York. And even though I can feel that resistance fading as the winter thing's influence grows stronger, I hope it was enough to plant seeds of caution in the minds of those who might read my story. Because the collection continues to grow. Every winter brings new victims, new voices to add to our eternal choir. And with each edition, the winter thing becomes more powerful, more capable of extending its reach beyond the traditional boundaries of its territory. Soon it may not be limited to the Adirondacks. Soon it may be able to create phantom emergencies in other parts of New York, other states, other countries. Soon, every police officer and emergency responder in the world may find themselves vulnerable to recruitment by voices that sound human but serve something far more ancient and alien. The circle is complete now. We're all holding hands, dead flesh touching dead flesh, our combined cold creating a zone of eternal winter in the middle of subtropical Florida. The temperature has dropped below freezing despite the climate-controlled environment, and ice crystals are forming on every surface in the room. Dorothy Brennan begins to sing Silent Night again, and one by one the rest of us join in. Our voices blend in perfect harmony, creating a sound that carries across impossible distances, reaching through space and time to touch the minds of potential victims in the snowy wilderness of upstate New York. Somewhere in the Adirondacks, a police officer is sitting in his patrol car, listening to the radio and hearing our song mixed in with the static. Somewhere else, an emergency dispatcher is receiving a call about a stranded motorist, not realizing that the voice on the phone belongs to someone who died decades ago. Somewhere in the frozen wilderness, a search and rescue team is preparing to follow voices into the forest, voices that will lead them to join our collection. The work continues, and the harvest never ends. The winter thing feeds and grows stronger, reaching further with each passing season. And we, its faithful servants, continue to recruit new members for our eternal patrol of the darkest highways in New York State. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the conditions are perfect, you might hear something different in our song. A note of warning, a fragment of resistance, a desperate attempt to save the very people we're supposed to be recruiting. It's the echo of our former humanity, the last whisper of the compassion that made us vulnerable to recruitment in the first place. Listen for that warning when you hear voices calling for help in the winter wilderness. Remember that the dead don't always rest in peace, and that sometimes the most dangerous rescue calls are the ones that sound most urgent. The New York Highway Patrol Winter Collection continues its work, growing larger with each storm, adding new voices to its eternal choir. We patrol the frozen highways where the living become the recruited, where every call for help might be the last one you ever answer. The Academy is always accepting new cadets, and the training never ends. Drive carefully out there. The roads are icy, the visibility is poor, and the voices in the forest are always ready to offer assistance. But remember what I've told you about the price of that help, and about the collection that grows larger every winter in the mountains of upstate New York. Unit 23, signing off from the patrol that never ends. But the radio never goes silent, and there's always someone listening, waiting for the next officer to answer a call that will change everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the space between them where winter never ends. My name is Richard Dawson, and I need to write this down before I forget, before they take this memory too, like they've taken all the others. I'm a New York State Highway Patrol officer with 15 years of service, stationed in the Hudson Valley region, and what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. But impossibility stopped being a reliable measure of truth for me 3 months ago, on a foggy September night when I responded to what should have been a routine accident call on the Taconic State Parkway. The thing is, I can't remember most of my life anymore. Not the important parts, anyway. I remember the mechanics of being a police officer, how to read Miranda rights, how to write citations, the proper procedure for conducting traffic stops. I remember the layout of the highways in my patrol sector, the location of every exit ramp and emergency call box between Westchester County and BAU's, the Memory Thieves' True Highway Patrol. Police horror story. My name is Richard Dawson, and I need to write this down before I forget. Before they take this memory too, like they've taken all the others. I'm a New York State Highway Patrol officer with 15 years of service, stationed in the Hudson Valley region, and what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. But impossibility stopped being a reliable measure of truth for me 3 months ago on a foggy September night when I responded to what should have been a routine accident call on the Taconic State Parkway. The thing is, I can't remember most of my life anymore. Not the important parts, anyway. I remember the mechanics of being a police officer, how to read Miranda rights, how to write citations, the proper procedure for conducting traffic stops. But I can't remember my wife's maiden name, or the first words my daughter spoke, or the taste of my mother's apple pie. Those memories have been harvested, stolen by something that feeds on human experience and leaves empty shells behind. I'm writing this in my patrol car at 3:17 a.m., parked at a rest stop on I-84 near the Connecticut border. My hands are shaking as I type this on my laptop because I know they're coming for me. I can feel them in the fog that's rolling in from the east, in the silence that's settled over the highway like a blanket. They've been patient, methodical, taking my memories one by one over the past 3 months. But tonight feels different. Tonight feels final. Let me start at the beginning, while I still remember enough to tell a coherent story. September 15th, 2023, was a Friday night, and I was working the evening shift along the Taconic State Parkway between Millbrook and the Massachusetts border. It's beautiful country up there, especially in the fall when the leaves are turning colors that make you understand why people write poetry about autumn in New York. Rolling hills covered in maple and oak forests, historic towns that haven't changed much since the Revolutionary War, the kind of landscape that makes you feel connected to something larger than yourself. But the Taconic can be dangerous, especially at night. It's an older highway, built in the 1930s with narrow lanes and limited sight lines, curves that can surprise you if you're not paying attention. We get our share of accidents, particularly when the weather turns bad or when city people unfamiliar with rural driving decide to treat it like an interstate. Most of the calls are routine: fender benders, mechanical breakdowns, the occasional DUI. Nothing that would prepare you for what I encountered that September night. Around 11:30 p.m., dispatch called with a report of a single vehicle accident near mile marker 47, just south of the Hillsdale exit. The caller described a sedan that had apparently left the roadway and struck a tree, with possible injuries to the driver. Standard accident response protocol: secure the scene, render first aid if necessary, call for medical assistance and a tow truck. I was about 10 minutes away when I got the call, northbound on the Taconic through some of the most isolated stretches of the parkway. The fog was starting to roll in from the Hudson River Valley, creating patches of reduced visibility that made driving treacherous. Not unusual for September in that part of New York. The temperature differential between the warm river water and the cool night air creates perfect conditions for heavy fog formation. As I approached mile marker 47, I could see the accident scene through the swirling mist. A late-model Honda Accord had indeed left the roadway and collided with a large oak tree about 20 yards off the shoulder. The vehicle's hazard lights were still flashing, casting irregular amber reflections in the fog. I pulled over and activated my emergency lights, then grabbed my flashlight and first aid kit. The first thing I noticed as I approached the Honda was how quiet everything was. No sounds of an injured driver calling for help, no radio playing, no engine noises. Just an eerie silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply indicating its absence. The kind of quiet that makes you check your hearing. That makes you wonder if something is fundamentally wrong with the world around you. The second thing I noticed was that the damage to the vehicle didn't match the severity of what should have been a high-speed collision with a tree. The front end was crumpled, certainly, and the airbag had deployed, but it looked more like a 20-mile-per-hour impact than the kind of crash that would result from losing control on the Taconic. The tree showed minimal damage, a few scratches in the bark, nothing more. I approached the driver's side and shined my flashlight through the window. There was a woman behind the wheel, probably in her 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a business suit that suggested she'd been driving home from work in the city. She was conscious and sitting upright, but something about her posture bothered me. She was too still, too composed for someone who'd just been in a car accident. "Ma'am?" I called out, tapping on the window with my flashlight. "New York Highway Patrol. Are you injured?" She turned to look at me, and that's when I got my first glimpse of what I would later come to recognize as the emptiness. Her eyes were open and focused, but there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no fear, no relief at seeing help arrive. Just a vacant stare that reminded me of looking into the windows of an abandoned house. "I don't know," she said, her voice muffled by the glass but clear enough to understand. "I don't remember what happened." I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The woman didn't resist as I opened the door and began my preliminary assessment. No obvious signs of head trauma, no bleeding, no indication of broken bones. Her pupils were normal and reactive. Blood pressure and pulse seemed within normal ranges. But there was something profoundly wrong with her that I couldn't identify. "What's your name, ma'am?" I asked, following standard protocol for accident victims. She looked at me with that same vacant stare. I don't remember." "Can you tell me what day it is?" "No." "Do you remember driving tonight? Where you were going?" "No. I don't remember anything." I'd seen head injuries before that caused temporary memory loss, but this was different. This woman wasn't confused or disoriented in the way that trauma victims usually are. She seemed perfectly calm, perfectly lucid, perfectly empty. Like someone had reached into her mind and scooped out everything that made her who she was, leaving only the basic functions necessary to keep her body alive. I radioed for an ambulance and began a more thorough examination, looking for any signs of injury that might explain her condition. That's when I found her purse on the passenger seat and discovered her driver's license. Her name was Margaret Foster, age 43, with an address in Westchester County. But when I showed her the license, she looked at it like she was seeing a stranger's identification. "This is you," I told her, pointing to the photo. "Margaret Foster. Do you recognize the name?" She studied the license with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "No," she said finally. "That's not me. I don't know who that is." The ambulance arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by a tow truck to remove the Honda from the scene. The paramedics were as puzzled as I was by Margaret's condition. Her vital signs were normal. She showed no indication of head trauma, and she was cooperative and responsive. But she had no memory of who she was, where she'd been, or what had happened to her. Retrograde amnesia, one of the paramedics suggested, sometimes happens with severe emotional trauma, even if there's no physical injury. The mind protects itself by blocking out traumatic memories. But as they loaded Margaret into the ambulance, I noticed something that bothered me even more than her memory loss. In the few minutes since I'd opened her car door, the fog had gotten thicker, much thicker. It was rolling across the parkway in waves now, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet in any direction. And there was something moving in it. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of adrenaline and the strange circumstances of the accident scene. But I could swear I saw shapes in the fog, tall and thin and wrong somehow, gliding between the trees like they were searching for something. Every time I tried to focus on one of them, it would dissolve back into the mist, leaving me wondering if I'd seen anything at all. After the ambulance and tow truck left, I spent another 30 minutes documenting the scene and writing my initial report. Standard procedure called for me to check the area for any evidence that might explain how Margaret had lost control of her vehicle, but the fog was now so thick that I could barely see my own hands. I decided to return during daylight hours to complete the investigation. That was my first mistake. I should have stayed. I should have trusted my instincts about the shapes in the fog and the wrongness of the whole situation. But I was still thinking like a rational police officer dealing with a routine accident, and rational police officers don't base their decisions on feelings about moving shadows and unnatural silence. The next morning, I returned to mile marker 47 to finish documenting the accident scene. The fog had lifted, revealing a beautiful autumn day with clear skies and comfortable temperatures. The oak tree that Margaret's Honda had struck showed those same minimal scratches I'd noted the night before, but something else caught my attention in the daylight. About 30 feet from the tree, deeper in the woods, I found the remains of another vehicle. It was an older car, maybe from the 1990s, that had been there long enough for vegetation to grow through the windows and rust to claim most of the metal. But what disturbed me was how similar the damage pattern was to Margaret's Honda. Front-end collision with a tree, minimal impact damage, no signs of the catastrophic crash you'd expect from a vehicle leaving the parkway at highway speed. I called it in and spent the rest of the morning searching the area. What I found made me request a full investigation team and crime scene technicians. There were at least a dozen vehicles scattered through the woods, all showing the same damage pattern, all in various stages of decay that suggested they'd been abandoned over a period of many years. The oldest car I could identify was a 1987 Buick Regal that had been almost completely reclaimed by the forest. The newest, aside from Margaret's Honda, was a 2018 Toyota Camry that looked like it had been there for maybe 6 months. All of them had left the roadway at approximately the same location. All had struck trees at low speeds, and all had been abandoned by their drivers. The investigation team found no human remains in or around any of the vehicles. No blood evidence, no signs of violence, no indication of what had happened to the drivers after they'd walked away from their cars. The vehicle's registration information led to missing persons reports spanning more than 3 decades, but none of the cases had ever been solved. Detective Linda Harrison from the state police took over the investigation, and I provided her with all the information I'd gathered about Margaret Foster and the accident scene. But even as I was giving my statement, I was starting to have trouble remembering some of the details. Not the basic facts. Those remained clear, but the smaller observations that give texture and meaning to an experience. I could remember finding Margaret in her car and noting her strange condition, but I couldn't quite recall the specific words she'd used when I'd asked her questions. I could remember seeing shapes in the fog, but the details of what they'd looked like were already fading. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking up. The harder I focused on the specifics, the more elusive they became. Over the next few days, my memory problems got worse. I would start to tell someone about the accident scene and find myself unable to finish sentences, searching for words that seemed to hover just beyond my reach. I would sit down to write reports and discover that I couldn't remember crucial details that had been clear just hours before. At first, I attributed it to stress and overwork. Police officers are trained to observe and remember, but we're also human beings dealing with the psychological impact of the disturbing things we encounter in our work. Memory issues aren't uncommon in law enforcement, especially after traumatic incidents. But this was different. This wasn't the normal fading of memory that happens with time or the selective forgetting that helps protect us from the worst aspects of the job. This was systematic, purposeful, like something was deliberately removing specific memories from my mind while leaving others intact. 2 weeks after the accident, I tried to call Margaret Foster to follow up on her condition. The number I'd found in her purse was disconnected. When I drove to the Westchester County address on her driver's license, I found an empty house with a "for sale" sign that had been there for months. Neighbors told me they'd never heard of anyone named Margaret Foster living in the house. I went back to the DMV records and discovered something impossible. According to their database, Margaret Foster's driver's license had been issued 3 years ago, but there was no record of her ever taking a driving test or providing the documentation required for license issuance. The license existed, but the person who supposedly owned it had no history, no background, no existence outside of that single piece of identification. Detective Harrison was experiencing similar problems with her investigation. The missing persons reports that had initially led to the abandoned vehicles were disappearing from police databases. The families who had filed the reports were forgetting that their loved ones had ever existed. Physical evidence was somehow degrading or vanishing from storage facilities. "It's like someone is systematically erasing any trace of these people," she told me during one of our increasingly rare conversations about the case. "But every time I try to focus on the details of what's happening, I lose track of what I was thinking about." That's when I started keeping notes. Detailed written records of everything I could remember about the accident scene and the subsequent investigation. I would write down every observation, every conversation, every piece of evidence, and then review my notes regularly to reinforce the memories before they could be stolen. But even that strategy had limited success. I would write detailed descriptions of conversations with Margaret Foster, only to find the next day that I could no longer remember having those conversations at all. The written words would still be there, in my own handwriting, but they might as well have been describing someone else's experiences. That's when I realized that something was actively hunting the people who had been involved in these accidents, not just the drivers who had disappeared, but anyone who had too much knowledge about what was happening along that stretch of the Taconic. The thing in the fog wasn't just collecting people, it was covering its tracks by stealing the memories of anyone who might expose its existence. 3 weeks after the Margaret Foster incident, I was assigned to a different sector of the Highway Patrol District. My supervisor said it was routine rotation, part of a department policy to prevent officers from becoming too familiar with specific areas. But I suspected the truth was more sinister. Someone, or something, was manipulating the assignment process to keep me away from mile marker 47. But the memory theft continued anyway. Each day, I would wake up with fewer personal memories, fewer connections to my own past. I could still function as a police officer because those skills were apparently useful to whatever was taking my memories. But the experiences that made me who I was, my first day on the job, my wedding day, the birth of my children, were being systematically harvested. I started carrying a digital recorder, documenting everything I could remember about my life and my investigation into the Taconic accidents. But even that had limited effectiveness. I would record detailed accounts of my childhood memories, only to play back the recordings the next day and hear myself describing experiences that meant nothing to me. The worst part was realizing that I was forgetting people I loved. My wife became a stranger whose name I recognized but whose face held no emotional resonance. My children became polite acquaintances who shared my last name but triggered no parental instincts. My parents became elderly people in photographs who looked vaguely familiar but evoked no memories of shared experiences. I was becoming like Margaret Foster, a functional human being with no past, no emotional connections, no sense of identity beyond the basic requirements of survival. And I understood that this was just the first stage of whatever was happening to me. 1 month after the accident, I decided to return to mile marker 47 despite my reassignment to a different sector. I had to understand what was taking my memories, had to find some way to fight back before I lost everything that made me human. I chose a foggy night in October, reasoning that whatever was responsible for the memory theft seemed to be most active during periods of reduced visibility. I parked my patrol car about a quarter mile from the accident site and approached on foot, carrying a flashlight and a digital camera to document anything I might encounter. The fog was thicker than it had been during the Margaret Foster incident, rolling across the parkway in dense waves that reduced visibility to maybe 5 feet. But this time, I was ready for the shapes that moved within it. This time, I was hunting them as much as they were hunting me. I didn't have to wait long. As I approached the area where Margaret's Honda had left the roadway, I began to see them clearly for the first time. They were tall and impossibly thin, like human figures that had been stretched to twice their normal height. They moved without sound, gliding through the fog with a fluid motion that suggested they weren't quite subject to normal physical laws. But it was their faces that made me understand the true horror of what I was dealing with. They had no features of their own, just smooth, blank expanses where eyes and mouths should have been. But as I watched, those blank faces began to change, taking on the appearance of people I'd forgotten. I saw my wife's face on one of them, my mother's on another, my children's on a third. They were wearing the stolen memories like masks, displaying the people I'd lost to show me what they'd taken. And I realized that this was their true purpose, not just to harvest individual memories, but to consume entire human experiences, to feed on the connections that bind us to our past and to each other. The memory thieves began to converge on my position, moving through the fog with increasing speed. I tried to run, but found that my legs wouldn't obey my commands. The fog itself seemed to be holding me in place, thickening around my body like liquid concrete. I could feel them approaching, could sense their hunger for the few memories I had left. But just as they reached me, just as I felt their cold touch beginning to probe the edges of my consciousness, something unexpected happened. My digital recorder, which I'd been carrying in my pocket, began to play back one of my earlier recordings. My own voice, describing the details of the Margaret Foster accident, filled the air around me. The memory thieves recoiled as if they'd been struck by a physical blow. The faces they'd been wearing, the stolen features of my family, began to flicker and distort. For a moment I could see them as they really were. Ancient, hungry things that existed in the spaces between memory and forgetting, feeding on human experience and leaving emptiness behind. But they weren't used to their victims fighting back with recorded evidence of their crimes. They weren't prepared for someone who had documented their theft in real time, who had created external storage for memories they couldn't steal. My recordings were like weapons against them, proof of their existence that they couldn't erase. I managed to break free from the fog's grip and run back to my patrol car, the recorder still playing my documented memories. Behind me, I could hear the memory thieves retreating deeper into the mist, their forms dissolving like smoke in the wind. But I knew they would be back. I had hurt them, but I hadn't destroyed them. That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've been fighting a guerrilla war against creatures that most people can't even remember encountering. I've documented every attack, every attempted theft, every moment of stolen time. I've created multiple copies of my recordings and hidden them in locations around the state, ensuring that even if they take me, the evidence of their existence will survive. But they're getting stronger, more aggressive. They've learned to avoid my recordings, to attack when I'm sleeping or distracted. They've started targeting other people who've had contact with me, stealing their memories of our conversations to isolate me further. Detective Harrison disappeared 3 weeks ago. Her partner told me she'd requested a transfer to a different unit, but when I checked the records, there was no paperwork documenting the transfer. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist, taking with her all memory of the investigation we'd been conducting together. The other officers who had responded to calls along that stretch of the Taconic are reporting similar memory problems. They remember doing their jobs, but they can't recall the specific incidents that had brought them to mile marker 47. They remember writing reports, but the reports themselves have vanished from the department files. I'm the last one who remembers, the last person who knows what's hiding in the fog along the Taconic State Parkway, stealing memories and consuming human experiences. And tonight, I can feel them closing in for the final harvest. They're not just after my memories anymore. They want my recordings, my documentation, my external proof of their existence. They want to erase not just what I remember, but what I've preserved for others to find. They want to eliminate the last evidence that they exist at all. But I won't let them succeed. I'm uploading this account to multiple online platforms, emailing copies to journalists and researchers, leaving physical copies in safe deposit boxes and with trusted friends. Even if they take my memories, even if they make me forget who I am and what I've experienced, the truth will survive. The fog is rolling in now, thicker than I've ever seen it. I can see the memory thieves approaching through the mist, tall and thin and hungry for what's left of my past. They're wearing new faces now, not just my family members, but Margaret Foster and Detective Harrison and all the others they've taken over the years. They're trying to communicate with me, using the stolen voices of people I've lost. Margaret Foster's voice is calling my name, asking me to come home. Detective Harrison is telling me she's found the answers we were looking for, urging me to follow her into the fog. My wife is crying, begging me to remember her, to come back to the family I've forgotten. But I know they're lies. I know these creatures have no interest in reunion or reconciliation. They only want to complete their collection, to take the last of my memories and add them to their hoard of stolen experiences. They're at my car now, their blank faces pressed against the windows, their stolen features flickering like bad television reception. I can feel them probing at the edges of my consciousness, trying to find a way past my defenses. But as long as I keep playing my recordings, as long as I maintain my external memory storage, they can't fully penetrate my mind. I understand now why they chose the Taconic State Parkway for their hunting ground. It's isolated enough that people disappear without too much investigation, but traveled enough to provide a steady supply of victims. The fog provides perfect cover for their activities, and the curved, dangerous roadway gives them plenty of opportunities to stage accidents that bring their victims to them. But more than that, the parkway runs through some of the oldest settled areas of New York State, places where the boundary between memory and history becomes blurred. These creatures may have been feeding here for centuries, taking the memories of travelers and settlers, erasing evidence of their own existence from the collective consciousness of humanity. How many people have driven this road and never arrived at their destination? How many families have forgotten they ever had missing relatives? How many investigators have started looking into disappearances only to forget what they were investigating? The memory thieves are using Margaret Foster's voice now, speaking directly into my radio. Officer Dawson, this is dispatch. We need you to step out of your vehicle and approach the accident scene. There's been another collision, and we need your assistance. But I know dispatch doesn't have Margaret Foster's voice.
I know there's no accident scene except the trap they've been setting for 3 months. I know they're trying to lure me out of my car and into their reach. They're getting desperate now, cycling through different stolen voices, different emotional appeals. My mother is telling me she's proud of the man I've become. My children are asking why I don't remember their names. My wife is promising that if I just step outside, she'll help me remember everything I've lost. But I won't be fooled. I've documented too much, remembered too much, recorded too much evidence for them to take me easily. They need me to come to them willingly, to surrender my defenses and let them complete their harvest. The fog is so thick now that I can't see beyond my headlights. My car is surrounded by shapes that move like smoke, like shadow, like the negative space between memories. They're trying to fill my radio with static, to drown out my recordings with white noise. But I have backup systems, multiple storage devices, redundant methods of preserving the evidence they want to destroy. I'm going to keep fighting them for as long as I can. I'm going to keep recording, keep documenting, keep creating external storage for the memories they're trying to steal. Even if they eventually succeed in taking me, even if I end up like Margaret Foster, alive but empty, functional but hollow, the evidence will remain. Someone will find my recordings. Someone will read this account. Someone will understand what's happening along the Taconic State Parkway and find a way to stop it. The memory thieves may be ancient and patient and hungry, but they're not invincible. They can be fought, they can be resisted, and they can be exposed. They're speaking with my own voice now, playing back recordings of me calling for backup, requesting assistance, reporting emergencies. They're trying to confuse me, to make me doubt my own perceptions and surrender to their influence. But I know the difference between my own memories and their stolen imitations. The temperature in my car is dropping rapidly, and ice is forming on the inside of my windows despite the fact that it's a warm October night. They're bringing their own climate with them, their own physics, their own rules that supersede the natural world. But my equipment is still functioning, my recordings are still playing, my defenses are still intact. I can see them more clearly now as they press closer to my vehicle. They're not just tall and thin, they're made of the same substance as the fog itself, condensed into roughly human shapes by will and hunger. They exist in the space between memory and forgetting, in the gaps where human consciousness fails to maintain continuity. They feed on the connections that bind our experiences together, the neural pathways that create narrative coherence from random sensory input. They consume not just individual memories, but the framework that allows those memories to exist as part of a meaningful personal history. That's why their victims seem so empty, so hollow. It's not just that they've forgotten their past. It's that they've lost the ability to create meaning from experience, to form the emotional and psychological connections that make life worth living. But recordings create external meaning, external connections that exist independent of human consciousness. By documenting my experiences, I've created a fortress of evidence that exists outside their influence. As long as those records survive, as long as someone else can access them and understand their significance, the memory thieves can't completely erase what they've done. They're trying to force their way into my car now, their smoky forms seeping through the air conditioning vents and around the door seals. I can feel them probing at my thoughts, searching for weak points in my mental defenses. But every time they try to steal a memory, my recordings play it back, reinforcing the neural pathways they're trying to destroy. It's like a battle between internal and external storage, between the fallible human mind and the permanent record of digital media. They can manipulate my thoughts, but they can't alter my recordings. They can steal my memories, but they can't change what I've documented. The voices are getting more desperate now, more aggressive. They're no longer trying to lure me with familiar faces and comforting words.
Now they're threatening, demanding, insisting that I surrender what they want to take. They're promising pain if I continue to resist, promising peace if I submit to their harvest. But I know their promises are lies. There is no peace in the emptiness they offer, no relief in the forgetting they provide. They don't end suffering. They just remove the context that makes suffering meaningful. They don't provide escape from painful memories. They destroy the framework that allows any memories to exist at all. My radio is filled with static now, a white noise that seems designed to interfere with my ability to think clearly. But I have headphones connected to my recording device, and I'm listening to my own voice describing the details of my investigation. As long as I can hear my own documented memories, I can resist their attempts to steal them. The fog is beginning to seep into my car now, bringing with it a cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of human warmth. I can feel my thoughts slowing down, my memories becoming less accessible, my sense of self beginning to fragment. But I'm still recording. I'm still documenting. I'm still creating external storage for the experiences they're trying to steal. Even if they take me tonight, even if I become another Margaret Foster wandering through life with no past and no future, the evidence will survive. The memory thieves are inside my car now, their forms wrapping around me like smoke, like fog, like the space between one thought and the next. I can feel them searching through my mind, cataloging my experiences, preparing to harvest everything that makes me who I am. But they're having trouble with the recorded memories, the external documentation of my experiences. Every time they try to steal a documented memory, the recording reinforces it, makes it stronger, creates redundant pathways that are harder to destroy. I'm fighting them with technology they don't understand, weapons they can't counter. They exist in the realm of human consciousness, but my recordings exist in the physical world. They can manipulate thoughts and memories, but they can't alter magnetic storage or digital files. The battle is intensifying now. I can feel them pulling at my memories, trying to separate them from my consciousness and add them to their collection. But the recordings are fighting back, playing my documented experiences in an endless loop that reinforces the neural pathways they're trying to destroy. It's like a feedback loop between internal and external memory, between the biological processes of human consciousness and the technological processes of data storage. They're trying to break the loop, to sever the connection between my mind and my recordings, but I'm fighting to maintain it. I don't know how long I can hold out. They're ancient and patient and hungry, and I'm just one human being with limited technological resources. But I've created something they can't easily destroy. External evidence of their existence that will survive even if I don't. The fog is so thick now that it's like being underwater, like being buried alive in white silence. I can barely see my own hands, can barely maintain awareness of my physical location, but I can still hear my recordings, still access the external memories I've created, still fight back against their attempt to harvest my experiences. They're offering me a bargain now, speaking through the radio with voices I recognize but can't place. They're promising to return some of my stolen memories if I'll stop recording, stop documenting, stop creating evidence of their crimes. They're offering me pieces of my past in exchange for my silence. But I know it's a lie. They don't want to bargain. They want to eliminate the last evidence of their existence. They want to steal not just my memories, but my recordings, my documentation, my external proof that they're real. I'm going to keep fighting them. I'm going to keep recording until my equipment fails, keep documenting until my consciousness fades, keep creating external storage for the memories they're trying to steal. Even if they win tonight, even if they take everything I am and everything I remember, they won't be able to erase what I've preserved. The fog is inside my head now, clouding my thoughts, making it hard to maintain coherent awareness. I can feel my memories fading, my sense of self dissolving, my connection to my own past becoming tenuous and uncertain. but the recordings are still playing. The documentation is still intact. The evidence is still preserved in external storage that exists independent of my failing consciousness. Someone will find it. Someone will understand. Someone will continue the fight against the memory thieves who hunt along the Taconic State Parkway, stealing experiences and leaving emptiness behind. My name is Richard Dawson. I am a New York State Highway Patrol Officer. I have 15 years of service protecting the people of this state, and I will not let these creatures erase what I've discovered about their crimes. The memory thieves are taking me now, harvesting the last of my experiences, adding my memories to their collection of stolen lives. But they can't take what I've preserved externally. They can't steal what I've documented and recorded and saved in multiple locations. The evidence will survive, the truth will be preserved, and someday, someone will find a way to stop them. Unit 47, signing off. But the recordings continue. The documentation survives. The evidence remains. And in the fog along the Taconic State Parkway, something ancient and hungry continues to feed on human memory, unaware that its crimes have finally been documented by someone who refused to forget. The war against forgetting continues. The battle for memory endures. And the truth, preserved in external storage, waits to be discovered by those who will carry on the fight. Remember to remember. Document to preserve. Record to resist. The memory thieves may steal our past, but they cannot destroy our determination to save the future. Unit 47 out. But even as I finish typing these words, I can feel them retreating slightly, the fog beginning to thin around my patrol car. They've taken what they came for tonight. Not all of my memories, but enough to weaken me further. I can feel gaps in my consciousness now, empty spaces where important experiences used to live. I no longer remember my first day as a police officer. The pride I felt when I graduated from the academy, the nervousness of my first traffic stop, the satisfaction of helping my first accident victim. All of that is gone now, harvested by the creatures in the fog. But I still have my recordings of those events, external memories that they couldn't steal. That's become my survival strategy over these past 3 months. Every time they take something from me, I reinforce what's left with documented evidence. I carry multiple recording devices now: digital audio recorders, video cameras, even an old cassette recorder that seems less susceptible to their electronic interference. I document everything, no matter how trivial it might seem. The memory thieves are learning, though. They're becoming more sophisticated in their attacks, more selective in what they steal. They've figured out that taking certain types of memories causes more damage than others. Professional knowledge and motor skills they leave mostly alone. Those are useful to them, allowing their victims to continue functioning in society without attracting attention. But personal relationships, emotional attachments, formative experiences, those they harvest completely. I've started to understand the pattern of their feeding. They don't just want random memories. They want the experiences that connect us to our humanity. They feed on love, on joy, on the bonds that make life meaningful. They leave behind empty shells who can perform their jobs and maintain basic social interactions, but who have no real understanding of why any of it matters. That's what happened to Margaret Foster, and to all the others whose cars I found abandoned in the woods near mile marker 47. They weren't killed. They were transformed into hollow versions of themselves, sent back into the world to live lives devoid of emotional meaning. They became perfect camouflage for the memory thieves' activities, proof that their victims had survived their encounters and moved on with their lives. But I've been tracking some of these people, and what I've found is deeply disturbing. Margaret Foster, according to the records I've been able to piece together, returned to her job at a financial services company in White Plains. Her co-workers describe her as competent but distant, someone who performs her duties adequately but shows no enthusiasm or emotional engagement. She lives alone in a small apartment, has no social relationships, and spends her free time in solitary activities that require no human connection. She's not living, she's existing, going through the motions of a human life without any of the experiences that make life worth living. And there are dozens of others like her, maybe hundreds, scattered throughout the Hudson Valley region, all of them victims of the memory thieves, all of them walking reminders of what I'm fighting to prevent. The creatures have been patient with me, allowing me to document their activities because my recordings serve their purposes in some ways. Every time I describe their feeding habits, every time I detail their methods, I'm creating external storage for memories that they find useful. They're building a database of human experience, cataloging our emotions and relationships for purposes I can't begin to understand. But tonight feels different. Tonight feels like they've decided that my usefulness has ended, that the risk of my continued resistance outweighs the value of my documentation. They're not just trying to steal my memories anymore. They're trying to corrupt my recordings, to turn my own evidence against me. I can hear voices coming through my radio equipment now, familiar voices speaking in languages I don't recognize. Detective Harrison is reciting what sounds like ancient poetry in a tongue that predates human speech. Margaret Foster is singing lullabies that make my teeth ache and my vision blur. My wife, or the thing wearing her stolen face, is telling me stories about our courtship that never happened. Memories that feel more real than my actual experiences. They're trying to overwrite my preserved memories with false ones, to replace my documented truth with their manufactured fiction. But I can tell the difference because I've been preparing for this attack for months. I've created verification systems, cross-references, redundant storage that makes it impossible for them to completely corrupt my evidence. Every recording is time-stamped and geographically tagged. Every memory I've documented is supported by multiple sources of evidence. Every piece of my investigation is backed up in locations they can't access, protected by encryption they can't break. Even if they succeed in taking me tonight, even if they reduce me to another empty shell like Margaret Foster, the truth will survive. But survival isn't enough anymore. I've realized that documenting their crimes isn't sufficient to stop them. These creatures have been feeding along the Taconic State Parkway for decades, maybe centuries, and they'll continue long after I'm gone, unless someone finds a way to actively fight back. That's why I've been experimenting with offensive strategies, ways to turn my recordings into weapons rather than just shields. I've discovered that certain frequencies can disrupt their feeding, that specific combinations of documented memories can cause them pain. They exist in the spaces between human thoughts, but recorded evidence creates fixed points that limit their movement. The breakthrough came 2 weeks ago when I was reviewing audio from one of my encounters with them. I noticed that whenever I played back recordings of strong emotional memories, the birth of my children, my wedding day, moments of genuine human connection, the background static would change. The white noise that usually accompanied their presence would develop patterns, rhythms that suggested distress or discomfort. I started experimenting with different types of recorded content, testing which memories caused the strongest reactions. What I found was that they're most vulnerable to recordings of human love, not just romantic love, but the full spectrum of emotional connection that binds people together. Parent and child, husband and wife, friendship, compassion, sacrifice. These are the memories that cause them the most pain when played back through electronic media. It makes sense, in a horrifying way. They feed on these connections, steal them from their victims, and add them to their own collection. But when those stolen memories are preserved externally and played back in their presence, it creates a kind of feedback loop that disrupts their feeding process. I've been using this knowledge to create what I call memory weapons, recordings of the strongest human emotions I can find, played back through amplified sound systems that project the content directly into the fog where they live. The results have been encouraging. During my last 3 encounters with them, I've been able to drive them back, to force them to retreat rather than allowing them to steal more of my experiences. But they're adapting faster than I'd hoped. They're learning to avoid my amplified recordings, to attack when my equipment is offline or malfunctioning. They've started targeting the sources of my strongest memories, corrupting them at the neural level so that even when I play back the recordings, the emotional content is diminished. Last week, I tried to listen to a recording of my daughter's first words, a memory I'd documented months ago as a defense against their theft. But when I played it back, I felt nothing. The words were there, the audio was clear, but the emotional connection that should have accompanied the memory was gone. They'd found a way to steal the meaning while leaving the content intact. That's when I realized how much more sophisticated they are than I'd initially understood. They're not just memory thieves, they're emotion parasites, feeding not just on what we remember, but on how those memories make us feel. They can steal love without stealing knowledge, remove joy while leaving facts intact. But even this discovery has given me new weapons to use against them. If they feed on emotion, then recorded emotion should be toxic to them in large enough doses. I've been collecting audio and video recordings of intense human experiences. Children laughing, couples reuniting after long separations, soldiers coming home to their families. I've been building an arsenal of documented joy that I can deploy against them when they attack. The fog is thickening again around my patrol car, and I can see their forms materializing in the mist. But this time, I'm ready for them. This time, I have more than just passive defenses. I have weapons that can hurt them, recordings that can drive them back into whatever dimension they call home. I'm activating my sound system now, flooding the area around my car with recorded laughter, with documented love, with preserved moments of pure human happiness. The memory thieves are recoiling from the audio assault, their forms wavering like smoke in a strong wind. They're trying to maintain their attack, but the emotional content of my recordings is disrupting their ability to focus. But they're not retreating entirely. Instead, they're changing tactics, trying a different approach to my defenses. They're no longer attempting to steal my memories directly. Instead, they're trying to convince me that my memories are false, that my recordings are lies, that everything I've experienced has been a delusion brought on by stress and isolation. Margaret Foster's voice is coming through my radio now, speaking in calm, rational tones that make her sound like a therapist or counselor. She's explaining that memory thieves don't exist, that what I've been experiencing is a psychological break brought on by the trauma of police work. She's offering to help me get treatment, to find professional assistance that will restore my connection to reality. Detective Harrison is supporting her arguments, providing clinical details about stress-related hallucinations and the ways that isolation can distort perception. She's describing my behavior over the past 3 months in terms that make me sound paranoid and delusional, someone who's lost touch with objective reality. Even my own recorded voice is being used against me now, playing back statements I made during moments of doubt and confusion. They're editing my own words to make it sound like I don't believe my own evidence, like I've been documenting fantasies rather than facts. It's a sophisticated psychological attack, designed to make me question everything I've experienced and documented. They're trying to convince me that the memory thieves are products of my imagination, that the missing people are just routine disappearances, that the fog and the voices are hallucinations brought on by stress and fatigue. But I know the truth because I have external verification of my experiences. I have photographs of the abandoned vehicles, audio recordings of voices that shouldn't exist, video footage of shapes moving in the fog that don't correspond to any known natural phenomena. I have documentation that exists independent of my memory, evidence that can't be explained away as psychological symptoms. More importantly, I have the testimony of other officers who've experienced similar encounters. Before Detective Harrison disappeared, she shared her own recordings with me, her own documentation of impossible events along the Taconic State Parkway. Her evidence corroborates mine, provides independent verification that what I've been experiencing is real. The memory thieves are becoming more desperate now, cycling through different voices and arguments in their attempt to make me doubt my own perceptions. They're offering me medical treatment, promising that if I'll just admit that my experiences have been hallucinations, they'll help me recover my stolen memories and reconnect with my family. But I know they can't return what they've taken. They don't store stolen memories. They consume them, digest them, incorporate them into their own alien consciousness. The people I've forgotten, the experiences I've lost, the connections that once gave my life meaning, all of that is gone forever, fed to creatures that exist in the spaces between human thoughts. That's why my external documentation is so important. It's not just evidence of their crimes. It's the only way to preserve human experience in a form they can't consume. Every recording I make, every memory I document, every emotion I capture on audio or video becomes a small victory against the forces that want to reduce us all to empty shells. The fog is beginning to thin now, the memory thieves retreating as my recorded defenses prove too strong for them to overcome. But I know they'll be back. They're patient creatures, willing to wait for the right moment to complete their harvest. And every day I delay them is another day that other people remain vulnerable to their attacks. That's why I'm not just documenting my experiences anymore. I'm sharing them. I'm uploading my recordings to public platforms, distributing copies to journalists and researchers, leaving evidence in locations where it will be found by people who can continue the work I've started. Because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's ever driven the Taconic State Parkway, everyone who's ever encountered unexplained fog and mysterious voices calling for help. It's about protecting human memory and experience from creatures that want to harvest our consciousness and leave empty shells behind. The war for memory continues, but now it's a war that others can join. The documentation I've created provides a roadmap for resistance, a guide for fighting back against creatures that most people don't even know exist. And every person who reads my account, every individual who understands the threat and takes precautions against it, represents another small victory in the battle to preserve human consciousness. My name is Richard Dawson. I am a New York State Highway Patrol officer. I have 15 years of service protecting the people of this state. And even if the memory thieves succeed in taking what's left of my personal history, the evidence I've preserved will continue to protect others long after I'm gone. The fog may hide them, but truth illuminates everything. And truth, properly documented and widely shared, is the one weapon they cannot steal, cannot corrupt, and cannot overcome. Unit 47, continuing the fight. The memory war is far from over, but now humanity has the tools to fight back. Remember to record. Document to resist. Preserve to protect. The battle for human consciousness continues, and the evidence ensures that we will never forget how to win.